and we have big
And
boys
it's big.
here. Yeah, it is big, and it is boys. So, this is episode 55, which are 2 numbers back to back, which is doubling, which is almost 3. So, I don't know, there's a connection there somewhere. We're going to be talking about a lot of things related to plot and player investment and characters and all that other fun stuff. But first, as is customary here, we have to get the shitposts out of the way. So, Mesk, what's something stupid that comes to mind that you would like to discuss in the shitpost section of the Big Boys table? Does anything spring up at you?
Oh my god, there was so many things, but just to get sprung on, it's how about this? A couple days ago, when we first started getting hit with our heat wave, we were playing actually Fraud Night, which was not night at all for me. It was in the middle of the day.
Yeah.
But middle of the day is when it starts getting really roasting fucking hot in here. And there's all this insanity that was taking place. And it was kind of looking like I might have been able to just like go to sleep and hide in front of my air conditioner or whatever after playing a little bit of that mod. And then all this shit started happening. And then suddenly the landlord just shows up unannounced at the door and is like, hey, I'm going to spray everything with Weedkiller. Close all the windows until tomorrow morning. By the way, it's like 35 Celsius and rising, with extremely high humidity, and it's actually life-threatening conditions. Many people die in this, and to close all the windows and turn off all the air conditioners and everything like that is like literally unthinkable, but that's precisely what we had to do. Like, he couldn't have chosen like today, which is like 20-something and windy, or later in the week where it's more cloudy. He had to choose the worst fucking days imaginable. And of course, just like he always has for years, no forewarning whatsoever, just shows up. And I was told that normally with herbicide, you don't usually need to close all your windows, especially for that long. But I guess he just like sprays it with so much of it that you could smell this shit. It was super strong, even though all the windows were closed for most of the day. Eventually, when I got up, I opened them all up at like 1 a.m. And I went out there today, and all the weeds still seem to be alive and kicking, so I'm not really sure what the whole fucking point of the whole thing was.
At the end of it all. That's always the kicker, is the closer of the story, which is, and then nothing happened.
Yeah, nothing happened. So.
Perfect. Well, there's a shitpost for the viewers there, the listeners. I usually don't have super insane things happen around me these days, so I like to live vicariously through other people's insanity, which is precisely why my shitpost of my contribution is just going to be the continued insanity of trying to use Reddit to crowdsource game design ideas, which is, of course, Fraud Giant Studios. Those guys are really going for it with everything that they're doing. It's almost like, do you remember, Mesk, when we were bagging on Immortal for being terrible, like forever? And now, like, these guys have taken over
it's all a blur at this point to me.
Well, they've taken over the crown. You know what I mean? Like, there's a new challenger.
It is really like they're both rosters of rejects that come from a company who is a roster of rejects to begin with. So you are like distilling down the shit heap to the point that you can't even really call it water or shit anymore. And now they're in like this competition to dig underneath the barrel. They've passed barrel bottom. They've passed bikini bottom. SpongeBob can't even see them anymore. And they're still just digging to outcompete each other to reach the center of the earth, the center of the shit Sunday. And well, I don't know. Maybe they got like a bet going on. Maybe there's like money involved in this to see who can shit the hardest. And it's really quite the competition. You don't even really think about Immortal anymore because, Immortal was what? Just a bunch of nobodies who couldn't accomplish anything with StarCraft 2, so they decided to screw around in Unreal 4. They're using Unreal 4 too, aren't they?
I'm pretty sure, yeah.
Yeah. They both basically are making an embarrassment of themselves in an engine that really shouldn't look as bad as it does for both of their titles. But, with Immortal, it's just like I said, just really just a bunch of nobodies came out of nowhere and just like, we're going to make a phone game. And it's going to be for phone users. But then you got Fraud Giant Studios, and they're a little different because they were people who were in this shithole industry to begin with, and that's the only thing they've got going for them. They didn't even try to do anything with the rest of their careers up to this point. but they're flaunting that empty roster of raid check list, saying, look, we shoveled shit out of a bathroom filled with people who are passed out and vomiting all day long. We know how to make great games. By the way, Reddit, can you help us out?
I just don't get the Reddit thing in particular. It's like,
I don't know who the fuck would even associate with Reddit, especially with a project. It's just a horrible idea.
Like, I still can't square that circle. I already, like, there's like a clip from one of my streams where I was like going off about how like it doesn't make any sense. It still doesn't make sense to me now. I still haven't been able to square that circle. You have these guys who are supposed to like have like that one comment that I pulled out of a Twitch chat where it's like they have the greatest minds of RTS or something. Like,
if they had the greatest minds, maybe they would be trying to make something as opposed to just having other people throw darts at a dartboard and going off of that. You would think that they founded this studio off of some kind of actual idea. Maybe they just had like this bet or something, like strip poker and truth or dare or whatever, and somebody dared them to make a game studio, and suddenly a bunch of clueless idiots actually gave them the money to establish a brand and a trademark, and now they have to do something with it, and they realized, wait a second, we're talentless morons. We don't have any talent in the entire company. We don't know what to do. I guess we'll ask Reddit.
Well, I will say that it is funny to see them go on talk shows with everybody in the known universe and then be like, yeah, well, you know, our community said this. I was like, all right.
Our community.
Yeah.
We got updates. That makes you a part of our community.
Well, well, I don't know, man. I'll never be able to figure out what the idea is, where it's like, it's so incoherent to me. The concept of you being the expert game designer and then Reddit being the source of your ideas. Or at least some of your ideas. Literally everything is being talked about. Like, they go from the whole gamut where, like, there are people who say that they want, like, passives and abilities on units and being able to, you know, micromanage units to get better cost efficiency out of them, which is, like, sounds somewhat analogous to what I would want out of, like, it's one component I would want out of an RTS. But then you get people who are like, I really like the idea from Immortal to auto-train workers because why make it an interesting decision? Let's just automate it and, you know... Like, I don't get it. Like, you have all of these people. Like, these ideas cannot coexist. You can't have both. Because if you try to have both, if you try to satisfy both of the people that I just brought up as, like, the straw people that I just brought up as, for the sake of argument, you're not going to be able to. Like, it doesn't even work. These ideas do not collaborate together in any way, shape, or form. So, when you see situations like this, it's really bizarre. I say situations like this, but I can't think of a situation like this where professed experts decided that they would take completely discordant takes and opinions and thoughts and design directions from people who fundamentally want different things, but they still want all their money from both parties. So,
you know, both of those games, whenever I read anything about them, it kind of reminds me of that, what is it, Wall-E AI image generator that comes with the subtext. By the way, this reinforces stereotypical culture stuff, and that's so bad because it's...
Wait, does it actually say that on the website now? I didn't
they have a little warning about it, and it's funny. But, you know, then you end up with, like, a whole bunch, as one of my favorite examples is Shadow kissing Shrek, or Sonic kissing Shrek, and you get like one image just like semi-coherent, and the rest of it's just like this amorphous blob that can kind of resemble Shrek and Sonic, and they're kind of just it's AI generated imagery, and it shows it. That's what these two products remind me of, Immortal and whatever Fraud Giant Studios was slapping together. That this amorphous blob that kind of like pretends to be interactive software but really isn't, and you can really like see it that way. Like, you look at it, you just get that aversion. It's like a lot of people say, oh, anytime somebody posts AI generated art on their account, I'm gonna unfollow them. That's this general aversion I get hearing anything about these two titles. Is the two developers very clearly do not give a shit about games, and their products are just this AI generated meme. Like, you can't imagine anybody behind any of this actually taking any of it seriously. It's really just like advanced money laundering, like the Canadian housing market.
Well, maybe they could train an AI to design a game based on all of the Reddit replies that they've gathered, and I'm sure it would probably be, you know, exactly what you would think.
You might actually finally end up with an RTS product if an AI is allowed to sort through it, as opposed to intentionally malicious neckbeards.
Guys, we'll have a different idea about upkeep. I want to say a last word before we move on to the actual topics. Is Immortal? How depressed do you think those people are that they made their game name Immortal? And there's a subtitle. It's like Gates of Pyre, I think. So Immortal. That's the main name for their game. And then Blizzard makes a phone game before they finish their phone game. Isn't that sad? Diablo Immortal.
Oh, Diablo Immortal, HKS streamed to me some gameplay from that. And before, he basically literally fell asleep on it and vowed never to touch it again. And it is so bad. It is, like, I'm not even going to get into the microtransaction stuff because, preaching to the choir and all that, but that game is bad. Like, that game is bad. Objectively speaking, if you really have to play a phone version of Diablo, just stick with Diablo 3. It's literally the same thing, except this is a clunky cargo cult that's built off the framework of one of NetEase's other products. This is a NetEase, which is Chinese phone game that has just been reskinned using Diablo 3 assets. They're using the assets from Diablo 3. And it is, like, the basic core functionality of that game doesn't work properly. Nothing works properly. It is fucked. And a lot of little, like, quality of life or whatever ease of access things you might see in Diablo 3 that kind of like are halfway implemented into this title in a way that's really abrupt and jarring. The basic movement pathing doesn't work, where depending on where your cursor is, you get hooked on geometry and spin around crazily, or get stuck in a circle of perpetual spinning. All the units look like they came straight out of Mythos. It is just an unbelievable disaster. And then there's like the voice acting and the cinematics, the multiplayer, quote unquote, that isn't even multiplayer. It is an embarrassment, even by Blizzard margins. I really was absolutely shocked they didn't pull this like a day after it came out. And then I heard it made millions of dollars somehow, and I'm just like, this is definitely money laundering that's going on here. People are using this to bypass taxes or do something equally illegal. There's no way, nobody in their right mind would ever give this money. No way. I don't even believe even Reddit users would do that. There, just about every name in the industry for like streamers and stuff have shat on this. Is
By the way, if you were gonna try to make a counter argument to what Blizzard, like the Blizzard naysayers, when the "Don't you all have phones" thing came out, were basically saying like, well, phone games are usually low effort, cash grab, gotcha nonsense, and we want an actual game. And like that was like some basic construction of what they were complaining about. And then all of the people who were apologizing for Blizzard was like, well, Blizzard is epic and they'll make a great phone game. Just you wait. It'll be great. It'll not be like those other phone games. Meanwhile, it's okay, listen. They apparently have the most predatory and most ridiculous monetization. So they did supersede standards. It's just not the ones you wanted. If you were looking for a game that was actually enjoyable to play, a good game on the phone, then yeah, you got to look elsewhere. But if you're looking for the most ridiculous monetization, well, Blizzard's got you covered. That's where their, bread is buttered, so to speak.
Just the basic cost of like the skins and stuff on that is like 5, 6, 7 times more expensive than League of Legends. From what I recall, like I don't remember stuff in League of Legends costing you $35.
Yeah, only the high end. I can't believe I was about to say that without laughing. High end skins. What are they called?
I remember in regards to League of Legends skins. Yeah. I remember somebody in the Surrender at 20 comments saying that particle effects take effort to make, and literally all their skins are just recolored. It's like 2 seconds to change some hue shift values and something, or hue shift a texture in XN view. That was one of the things that really highlighted like the complete uneducated nature of the people who consume this shit and actually try to justify spending money on it, is they don't realize this is literally just like half a day of work at the absolute most.
I do like
something
when
that maybe requires a new animation, but even then they just slap that together in a few hours.
Well, it's really funny that they add animations to skins more frequently now, and they use that as a justification for why more skins are more expensive.
Yeah, it's a hand wave. Yeah.
But it actually reduces overall readability even more than the fact that they all just look like each other anyway. Especially all of like the random, like if you had to like take a random assortment of female champions, they especially, since most of them use the same rig anyway, like the fact that they all have like weird color palette stuff now, and like you didn't reserve
the colors are terrible.
Yeah, you didn't reserve like a set of colors for specifically trying to make sure that like these these champions were always going to be visibly like they would stand out or whatever. Like I don't even know how you would go about doing that exactly because you have so many champions. But it would be like if I was going to make an RTS game and then I had made like, okay, here's a unit and then here's like a unit from one race and they use colors from like 5 other races. Well, it's going to just get fucking confusing after at a certain point in the scale. So you just like obviously you wouldn't want to do that, but well, here they did. So, and the animation thing is especially funny because I always remember there was some Katarina skin that when you recalled, she like juggled a dagger and it looked like the start of her Q, and people were baiting Yasuo wind walls out with that, which is really funny. They don't even really look the same because obviously there's the recall beam first, but they're just like so trained to like press.
One of the worst things about the animations that they have in those is when they leave the selection circle. So their collision's in a completely different spot of where the model is.
Oh, yeah.
And if you're not really paying attention, you can easily misread that. And it's also just like really awful looking as well. Because you got the selection circles in the middle of nowhere. And Blizzard does this in World of Warcraft and everything too. It just looks really terrible. They're like, they would be root motion animations, but they don't have root motion. So they're just like animating over there somewhere. The model is just displaced in some random location as opposed to where it should be in the game world. And it always looks terrible. And the other thing that always got me a lot about the readability with the skins and stuff like that is this obsession with injecting vocal lines into everything. So every time they cast a spell or recall or do anything, sometimes even walking around, they have to utter like even up to like 5 words or more of dialogue. And it's just like, for one, there's not nearly enough dialogue to make it immersive. Like it gets grating very fast, even within like one game. And 2, it just all meshes together, and most of the time, since it's just random dialogue on an event and nothing really related to what's going on, except for a handful that have champion and champion interactions, which really don't make any sense in the context of the actual gameplay that we're having anyway, since we're not even in a campaign, let's say, a story-driven event. They just become an absolute mess for reads. The audio channels get all cluttered up. An already difficult to read game in terms of audio becomes even worse.
Well, that actually takes us very nicely over to the context of like one of the first topics of this show, which is something we teased in the last episode, which is obviously the whole like player bonds and the the relationships with characters. And one obvious way that you would want to try to make, like, I mean, I guess the context of it being multiplayer kind of eschews some of the context you would need to make this work. But the champion example that you just said, where it's like 2 champions talking to each other in some capacity because they're fighting each other or whatever, you could make that interesting. You could make it reinforce, the concept of whatever these characters are supposed to be and their histories and all that. It doesn't end up happening, and like you said, there's too few instances, generally speaking, too few variants of dialogue to make it so that it actually sticks. But at the same time, like what would a better, you have to start to think of it to yourself, like what would a better thing sort of look like? So you obviously were the one to sort of bring this topic up towards the tail end of the last episode. I'm assuming you've got some general thoughts for how to broach the subject and intro people to the concept. So first of all, I'll just ask you, what do you mean specifically by bonds, and how does that relate to characters?
Okay, so this is a really huge subject, and I highly doubt we're going to be able to tackle the whole thing in just one big boy's table, as big as it may be. But this is something I was breaching into discussion. It was something I was splintering into as a result of the very long-winded character-related discussions from my Unreal project. And when I look at like the League interactions, the first gut reflex I would say is why doesn't this work is it's not context sensitive. It's just something that's always there. It's always going to happen. In other words, it's sort of a nebulous thing. It's a forced interaction. And bonds is something we gotta kind of walk back a little bit to our context and the idea of bonds and what a bond is, what makes a bond with a character, an idea, a person. And this is a big one. This is definitely a big one. So the way I approached that within the original cast, which I never did complete because it is a very big thing to get into, I wasn't really sure how to word a lot of it because my vocabulary is not very good. But the way I look at bonds when we initially look at it is eventually we want the player to have a bond with a character in a manner that grounds you in the game and adds more value to individual actions and sort of reinforces the effort to succeed, the effort to improve. And then that feels as a natural transition to the actual in-game context. For example, let's say within Dark Souls, you're struggling a lot with a boss. You spent like an hour and a half, 2 hours, 3 hours. Or maybe you're like that one person who has spent 4 hours on a boss only to get disconnected because always online LMAO, right as you were about to finish him off. And but the character you're playing in these games has no real identity, no real face, because none of the Souls games have story. And El Derp Ring has just little quests and stuff like that, and there's still really not much story. That kind of comes with the whole prospect of your character customization and the lack of a real world that you're building from. And you eventually get the dialogue from quests, which people kind of just monologue at you. And then that's supposed to build the story, but you never really develop that connection between yourself and the player where you have a bond. Now, bonds can be a million different things. So in order to really look at this and think, okay, so let's say like Dark Souls 3, which I have much more intimate knowledge of than El Derp Ring, as I have not played El Derp Ring yet, just mostly by third-party conjecture here. And let's say we have a Derp Souls 3. The player character has nothing, no identity, no nothing. You have the bosses and stuff that maybe give you a line or something. Sometimes when you defeat them. The one that most noticeably comes to me is Prince Lothric or whatever. And you have these moments that are supposed to be epic and cinematic, and meanwhile you're like a giant rotund green man or a naked blue man with a chin that could split open a battleship or function as an icebreaker, just naked, using nothing but a two-handed sword, and it's like your character isn't even grounded in the world because of the customization thing. But even if you're trying to be like hyper derp, chivalrous knight role-playing PvPer, your character still isn't grounded in this world whatsoever. It's not grounded in any of the monologue, the item descriptions, which is From Software's idea of world building. You just exist as this nebulous thing, even though you're hyped up and some of his dialogue is being, the one who links the flames and all this other stuff. You don't have any real bond to your character, which means you have no bond to anything else in the game, which means the few little tidbits, the little breadcrumbs of a story that might have been developed for the game, had they really actually put effort into writing for the game, it all gets lost on you. You never really get grounded in that. That's something that sort of exists to the side. And it also exists to the side in terms of how you as a player are interacting with the game through your character, because your character never really interacts with any of this. And also, one of the other things that contributes to this is the non-specific way that other characters address you in the game. Like the undead, or I can't remember what they call you in El Derp Ring, but it's still just basically the same thing as the unkindled or undead or whatever. It's just like untempered or something like that. And they just do that because then it absolves them of the responsibility of really addressing the player character. It's just yet another brick taken out of the wall that would construct a passageway between you and actually establishing yourself in the game world. So we can look at all these examples and we can say, okay, so we're not really grounded in this, but how do we ground a player character, especially when we look at the context of all the other stuff that we try to do with our projects, which is establish a skill testing experience. Now, whether or not you would agree with the presentation of Dark Souls being skill testing or not, the reality is that most people will struggle with those games regardless of how well designed they actually are. And there's a lot of missed opportunity in that for grounding the player character within the concept of self-improvement and struggling to survive as a body. For example, the whole bonfire thing pretty much is never actually touched. There's a big disconnect between in-game events and then in-game attempts at establishing a grounding. And in order for a bond to be established, you have to have the whole idea of believability. We have to walk back and think about, okay, so what is a bond at the coremost aspect? And I like to think of bonds as bonds between people in the real world and replicating how that is. Something that gets you invested in something. So I broke down bonds into a variety of different things that are all very long-winded to really get into on this spot. But let's say there's a bond between you and your parents, generally speaking, even if the bond is one of hate. Even if your parents are a lot like mine, they were malicious, destructive, they tried to kill you. Maybe your father is like mine and lives his entire life in a bush because he's literally insane. You've never seen his face in your entire life. He should have at least been offering financial support for you in some shape or fashion, but, responsibility was too much for him. there's a bond of, at the very least, discontent. And it still forms a bond, because a bond is kind of like something that provokes a sense of attachment. And the attachment can be hate, it can be love, it can be kinship. It can even be, kinship is something that gets divided a lot, and the kinship is one I ultimately end up focusing a lot within the project, because the other ones are really kind of hard to establish. But the thing that really got me into this discussion was watching someone I know. She ran Sonic 2006 for the PS3, and she streamed it and recorded it for us. And for those of you who are blissfully unaware, Sonic 2006 may in fact be as bad as Diablo 3. And it is, at some points, extremely frustrating and extremely tedious and cheap. And the controls in it are not particularly good. So there was a lot of periods where the player for this project was extraordinarily frustrated. And one of the things that kind of made me think was when she was having difficulty using Silver's float ability. And she would jump and try to float. And she would say, "Damn it, Silver, why won't you float?" And what got me really thinking about this whole circulation of this interaction was the player taking a character's name in vain. A player deriving some expression, some instinctual expression of frustration into a character. That's what got me into the whole bonds thing. Is why is it like this? Now, this is something that's going to be kind of difficult to even present within the context of a genre other than something that's first person or third person. But with a third person, it's particularly easy because that character is always in front of the screen. So with Dark Souls, that would be the player character. Within Sonic, of course, it's the various gelatinous monstrosities that I honestly can't even call furries because there ain't anything furry about them. And, it got me to think, there's a bond that has formed between the act of frustration between the player and then the character. Now, the player in this context has previous experience with Sonic games to a fair extent throughout her life. So there is always some extent of... Here's where we get into the part where my limited vocabulary is going to struggle. There is a memory. It's like a reflex, a muscle memory of where you say a name and it invokes a muscle memory of an experience with that name. That connection is the bond. So when we extend this to something that's more major, like say, for example, family, I personally have a really hard time connecting with that because my family were my cats and evidently they're gone now. But that many people might argue is not the same as having a connection with your parents or whatever. I can't sympathize with that. But I can sympathize with the connection of having a kinship by, like... I had a way of describing it that was more elegant, but a kinship by struggle. Which is, say, for example, with my grandmother, we're both in the shit. We both have terrible physical health. Both of our mental health isn't very good. We're constantly struggling just to make it by week, just like, say, for example, the heat. The heat was horrible when we had to close up all the windows and we were both smelling this awful shit. That this other person is going through the same kind of experience that you are. That forms an intrinsic bond by experience. But in a sense, you might also feel pity for somebody who's going through a lot of stuff as well, and that might form a bond as well. A bond by kinship. A bond by... kinship by extent of tribulations. In all of these connections, when we think about these connections, we think about these bonds that form, a bond with a pet or a bond with a child, something that you might feel responsibility to look after, you might feel compelled to look after, and you might not even be able to put to words how or why you're like that. Now, me, I have too much of an emotional attachment to animals in my life. So I would go through extraordinary efforts at the expense of my own physical and mental health and general conditions and stuff like that to try to improve their conditions. And of course, they're not like people. They can't say, "Hey, thanks, buddy. in many cases, you might not even be able to construe a real response for that. So they certainly don't appreciate the same thing, but you still have formed a strong bond with them. And when we think about bonds in that matter, we can kind of establish a bond as being something exists within your life, and it carries a muscle memory that is not necessarily just a muscle memory. It is something that carries with it a sense of emotion, a sense of an attachment, which doesn't necessarily have to be a positive. It can be a neutral or negative attachment. It can be an attachment that you can't even ascribe to any particular alignment. For example, there is a lot of people who have a bond to, like, Donald Trump, just because of anything he said or done. They've just extended this supernatural bond to him that they have to, they either are enslaved to him, they think he's the greatest guy ever, they'll never second doubt him, or they hate him because the internet told them to. And then that formed a bond, even though they've never directly associated with this person. They don't know anything about him. They don't even know his, for example, the way he legislates. They're not even from the same country as him. No, they're not affected by anything he does. It's just the internet told them to hate it. And with bonds in particular, I think it's something that's kind of hard to bring to the forefront to really sit down, because I think that most people today, especially the younger generation, they don't really form bonds that, like for example, I would, especially with something inside of a game. Because most people are about instant gratification now. They have very, very short memories, very, very short attention spans. And there was a TED Talk, of all things, that I watched a while ago that talked about people who have difficulty concentrating or whatever. What it basically boiled down to is newer generation are sort of hardwired to... there was a way of describing it. Basically, God, it was right on the tip of my dick. I couldn't quite grab it.
Is it something to multitasking or something like that, or is it just...
No, it's more like... There's a word I'm searching for, and my Canadianness is showing. I'm not really into words. God. Stimulation. That's it, right there. They have to be constantly stimulated with new things over and over and over and over. They literally just kind of shut down mentally if they don't have constant new stimulation. And of course, that's why we go to like the phone generation and the phone games. Mm-hmm. You know, that's why you see the products we were mentioning before, you know, with these people who are very much adverse to the idea of even playing a game, because to them it's not about playing a game. It's about just having different flashing lights and seeing different results. The whole idea of even playing the game is appalling to them. And that's how modern products in general are built today, is, you know, you have a lot of either shortcuts out of the gameplay, or the gameplay is constantly and forcibly being changed. This really even draws all the way back to the whole idea of gimmicks within campaign maps. It is all about trying to tackle the psychological aspects of people who need constant changes and stimulation, who are basically, their brains are wired in such a way that they just cease to exist mentally if there isn't something constantly new and exciting pulling their attention every 10, 20 minutes at the slowest. And that's where we get into the concept of people saying, well, playing the RTS is boring. I bought this RTS, but I don't actually want to play an RTS. I want to play a point-and-click adventure where we have ceremonies for loot boxes every 2 or 3 minutes. And this stuff all gets broken down into an Excel sheet through focus marketing, and at the end of the road, you have shit like Diablo Immortal. And that's why the bond thing can be kind of difficult to break into, because bonds in general require the time to establish the bond. It's not something you're going to really establish right away. When someone is going to have this innate reflex where the name of the character is going to spring to mind over something else, then that's going to be as a result of a bond. And that's like in the expanse of a League of Legends match, especially when you're just coming into it, the character history and stuff like that, you don't know it, and there's no reason to know it. There's no reason to get invested into it. Riot has never introduced any interesting writing for the game at all.
They change it all the time anyway, too, just like their balancing for that matter. So,
you know, you had the original like Hero Arena championship thing, which was of course, the most interesting iteration, and it just wasn't epic enough for them, and they just had to shit all over it as they hired more and more diversity hires, and people like Ghostcrawler, and there's like that's what they shoehorn into your face when you start the match, and even if you are familiar with this context. If you are somebody who's regularly playing League of Legends, you've heard this interaction 100 times already or more. You know, people will rack up thousands of games on their record playing this competitively to even a minor extent. And the interactions will always be something that will then it gets mentally ejected. Because the only interactions that actually matter to the brain are something that they physically are interacting with. That's why the bonds with pets will be strong, the bonds with your parents will be strong, the bonds with associates in your real life will be strong, is because that is something you're physically interacting with. That's why if you have very distant family you really don't know anything about, and something bad happens to them, you might feel kind of bad because, well, I guess I kind of know of them, but something bad happens to some like your neighbor that you share a beer with every so often, you go to his grill every so often, it's just like, oh shit, Ted busted his nut and fell on a tractor and now he can't use his nut anymore. It's just real darn tootin' shame. Or my buddy caught the COVID or something like that, and now we can't have our night anymore, otherwise I'm gonna start sneezing. And these things all bring up their own little things where it's like, you get hit with these things much more hard than hearing about like something that happened in China, like, oh, the road conditions in China are insane because it's like,
yeah, there's no connection at all, really.
Their safety margins are completely different. People are dying all the time, as opposed to like there's a bad turn on my road and my mother's got to drive down there every so often. I'm really worried that someday some crazy maniac's gonna T-bone her car or something like that. Like, there's the way that you view information and the way that you absorb information becomes very different when there's a bond attached to it, which means that you want to have bonds forming with the things that you're interested in, the things that you're invested in. And what makes a strong grounding for the player to be introduced to the story is to have a reason to bond with the character they're playing. And that is going to be one of the things that drives people to watch competitive gameplay. Is first, you might be interested in it because for any number of reasons, say for example, you want to see high level gameplay, or maybe you're watching sports and you want to see athletes, or maybe your friend got you into it or whatever. But then as you get into the game and you get into the competitive environment, then you're going to start getting introduced to the individuals that are running the competitive environment. Like very recently, just by sheer chance, I watched a video on Discord. Someone linked about a wrestling match where a guy threw another guy off the top of a wire cage and he fell like 15 feet into a table onto the floor, and there was like nothing to really break his fall. Like the table just shattered, you hit the floor. And wrestling, of course, is obviously very staged or scripted, you might say, in the sense that it's not really real people fighting to kill each other or whatever, but people absolutely suffer injuries all the time. They break bones, break teeth, suffer concussions and stuff all the time. And, I went from being just kind of interested in this little image of wrestling because I remembered in the past, someone, one of the people that is in my life that now unfortunately suffers from fairly advanced dementia. He always watched wrestling all the time, and I never really got the appeal of it. But then, for some reason, during with that interaction, I was kind of interested in the story behind it. And there was another video that was like an interview with this guy in like 2021 or something like that, where he talked about that event in a little bit, and then some of the stuff coming out of it, and he started to have more of an appreciation for it. And that kind of makes me think about watching competitive games. When I was watching, say for example, StarCraft 1 or League of Legends, of course I knew about Boxer coming into StarCraft 1 because from Battle.net people knew who Boxer was. So that was kind of one of the things that drew me into that. And then when you watch the players, you might start getting invested into them. They're good games. You might start looking for the games that they've really struggled a lot, where their weak spots are, where their strong spots are. And then you might get more invested into them. Like, how much time have they been playing the game? Are they a part of a team? What are their records like? And then, you learn that, there's another match coming up that's going to be them trying for the championship. Like, I got kind of invested a little bit into Savior. and then also into July Zerg when July Zerg was trying to get the golden mouse or whatever it was. I can't really quite remember what it was, and he drill droned his way to victory, and that was one of the highlights of my time was watching StarCraft because he was really rooting for him. And that's a bond in a sense. It's not somebody you know in person. They don't know who you are. You'll never meet them, but you're rooting for them. You're invested into things that happen to them. Their losses and their victories stir some kind of thing with you because you've become invested in them for one reason or another. Maybe you identify with them. Maybe you just enjoy the way they play. Maybe it's just because you've watched them for a while. In the same sense, you might become invested in somebody who casts the game. Like, I really like the Korean casters. I didn't understand a damn of a word they were saying. I don't even know their names except for Kim Carrier, but I was invested in them because their energy really carried the game for me. When we want to look at coming into a game, especially when we look in the context of skill testing games that the player is going to be spending a long time in, what our goal should be first and foremost before we even start talking about introducing the player to the game world, to the plots, to the plot twists, to the dialogue and the monologues, to being the undead or the untempered or whatever, saving the world or destroying it, whatever choice you ultimately can make at the end of the game. We need to have the player have some kind of investment in what they're playing as, and what they're doing, and why they're doing it. And just the general moment-to-moment interactions need to carry some weight to them. And the way that we would do that is by establishing a bond with the player character. Now, obviously, it's going to be harder in an RTS. And that's probably something I should probably set aside for, later discussion, or at least maybe later in this cast. But I'm focusing really just on the controlling a single player character. The best way to establish a bond, in my experience, is through tribulations. We can't really attack a lot of the other kinds of bonds that exist, like the bonds of love or, even with malice and stuff like that. We can kind of try to do that. But we're really trying to focus on the kinship of struggle and trial, which would be that, as a base example that I was going to introduce to talk with is the idea of learning how to fight. The idea of figuring out how to fight, facing difficult battles and stuff like that. And obviously, this is a really complicated kind of thing to break into. Not everybody's going to form bonds the same way. Not everybody's going to connect to the things the same way. But if we're targeting an audience that has skill testing experiences in mind, the skill testing experiences, and keeping that consistent with the player character and how the player character is introduced and all that is this sort of like our basic building blocks. Is we have our player character, and one of the things that I really emphasize with this is the player character has to control well. The controls have to respond well. Things have to happen when you want them to happen. When you fight the controls, that fights the idea of building a bond. Because if we make the responsibility of failures your own, and therefore the responsibility of success your own, that builds a stronger relationship with what you're doing, because now you look at something in terms of reliability. So with League of Legends or Blizzard Dota, Heroes of the Storm, or any of these other games where I played certain specific player characters, I would build a bond with those player characters because I would always know that, if the controls were done well and I synced well with the way the abilities and the spells handled, I always know I could rely on things to behave a certain way when I tried to do them, which meant that reliability built a bond just based on the concept of interaction. And interaction concepts are going to be the most basic things that we build a bond with what we're playing. Ultimately, what we're playing, what it looks like, what it sounds like, in itself doesn't matter as much as long as it's something that can be identifiable and something that is distinct. So long as we have that groundwork that we can build a muscle memory where when we see it, when we see our actions in motion, they're readable and distinct and identifiable, that's all we really need. So it could be Sonic, it could be Mario, it could be something more sophisticated, it could be Mr. T. And then we have to have the interaction doing precisely what the player wants, which means the game always has to be responsive. It can't be automated. We can't be building your workers for you. The responsibility of failure and success has to be on the player. We really this is stuff that we're in the area where we're just rehashing stuff we talked about before, because that's really just how important this stuff is. That is why people stuck with StarCraft for 20 years, is because the formula works. And this is why I can only just shake my head every single time I hear about any of these people on Reddit or Twitter that are like, oh my god, it's queuing up units is bad. Harvesting resources is bad. You need the game to do all the thinking and the playing for you. Then you will never form a bond with the game. You won't even talk about forming a bond with any individual element of the game. People are not even playing a game anymore. There's no room for exploration.
So evidently this is like the bond topic is obviously new to the nomenclature or whatever for me. I haven't thought of it in these terms, but I do have a few things that I think might help focus the discussion on specific things, because you mentioned earlier, like, obviously different people are going to form bonds in different ways. And you also called back to, well, you said something that reminded me anyway of what you used to talk about the subject to begin with, which is that silver interaction where Schwa was complaining about the fact that he wasn't doing anything. He's taking the character's name in vain instead of probably what I would do, which is why did they program it that way or something? You know what I mean? And so that's kind of like, it sounds like to me that especially as far as bonds are concerned with characters or other elements, it's strong feelings that you lose yourself in almost as a player. And that in such a state, you don't really ever get to think about, you know, your suspension of disbelief or your immersion, because you are immersed and it's just automatic. You're actually engaging with the characters instead of being distracted by technical shortcomings. And that kind of synchronizes with the silver example, because I would probably just complain about the developers instead of complaining about the character directly. But that's because I'm a different kind of person. And so presumably the bond formation is maybe harder for me, or maybe just is different, and like different things will work better for me, which I suspect is some combination thereof. So it kind of leads us to the topic of basically like something that is another callback to the previous episode is the thankless tasks idea, which is in the perfect world, you won't even notice that all of these things are working, and you will just lose yourself in the characters. You will just, form those bonds, so to speak. Because if you don't, and it's something more like, the what you brought up with the Dark Souls example, and having all of these dialogue lines that don't really refer to who you are specifically, who your character is specifically. They refer to a generic thing. It puts you into a thought process, which is why weren't they more specific? Why didn't they go a step further to reference specific things I did, or maybe reference a different title that I may have earned throughout my playthrough? And then you get into things that are completely unrelated to the actual game. You start to think about the budget and the time put into it, and it stops becoming an immersive experience immediately. You just shatter that right then and there because you're considering outside factors, which, again, maybe that makes it harder for people who are more savvy and more learned and more interested in the industry side, or just more knowledgeable about it. Maybe that does mean that it's harder for people like us to form bonds in that way. But I suspect that if the cards were dealt correctly in the first place, you probably would see that happen all the time anyway. It's just that it does seem that very few cases ever happen that. So the focused question really is like, what would be some examples where the bond formation happened, maybe for you specifically, that wasn't sort of sapped at, the quality wasn't marred by the fact that there was this technical shortcoming, or there was this like obvious hole in the way that the characters addressed you in dialogue? Was there anything like that comes to mind for an example, or did you think up this sort of conception, and did it maybe take a long time to think up this conception precisely because there weren't that many examples? What do you have to say about that?
I'm actually going to take a look at my LP list right now, because I might have one or two I can go off of.
Yeah, well, obviously there's Conan, great game, great character.
Yeah, like when I think about bonds, it's going to be like negative or positive. But actually, when I was first thinking my response to that, the first response I was thinking of, multiplayer games. Because you're playing with personalities which are people. And then that builds bonds.
Oh, sure, like Warlords and Merchants or whatever, with Ricky and stuff.
Or even more recently, the Warcraft 3 TGS games we've been playing as well. Because you reinforce bonds through constant interaction. And multiplayer is really the biggest way to do that. Like, I think a lot of people can probably emphasize to some extent with playing games with either their family members or people on the internet or something to that extent. Anybody who's really like regularly playing multiplayer with people that they know of will have some sense of having built bonds with that. Because a bond is like, if I think let's say in the context of StarCraft 2, I think of Ricky, the first thing I think of course, is putting Reapers in bunkers and all these other just strange and silly things that he's done that just became memes. And then they just endured over the years. And they're just like even something I refer to even present day. And that has built, the experiences were built that way because of bonds. They were things that happened. And as a result, you have a bond with that, which means that you can reinforce, like, if I was to make, like, well, I was making, like, joke campaigns way back, whether these community members were characters inside of the project. And as a result, we would always have a pool of experiences to reference from that we can reincarnate within that, where Ricky would build Reapers and Hellions and do strange things. And as far as stuff I have played, I kind of actually think, like, even to... Well, actually, this kind of actually brings me to another observation. It's a little bit of a fork, but it reminded... I'm looking at my list to see Yoshi's Island. I was just reminded that the developers said they made Mario's crying intentionally loud and annoying to really encourage you to try to get him back. And that was something that kind of really stood out me in the moment. And it's like, that is definitely kind of sort of on the same vein of the idea, just more or less heavy-handed. I mean, God of War, honestly, really stands out in the sense that you are going, like, at least as far as my runs are concerned, went through 4 different titles with one character. And the character changed here and there, but the voice actor was always the same. And one of the things that really stood out to me in God of War is how one of the making of videos showed his voice actor. He's like a very diminutive, non-threatening black guy. I think he was black anyways. And he was definitely not who you really expect to have that kind of a voice. And Kratos did have a fairly defining voice. Now, the writing in God of War was certainly nothing to hoot about, but when I think about God of War, I think like the things that muscle memory really provokes to me is the heavy attack spam I use to try to corral stuff. And then, of course, the really awful fighting input latency and general unfair bullshit. And then, of course, quick time events. So there's like a string of different interactions that come with that. And really, the one that I would focus on in this context is the heavy attacks to corral stuff, because it's an interaction thing. It's the thing that stands out when I think about God of War is that specific moveset that I constantly used to try to stun lock stuff, to try to corral things, to try to manipulate the game effectively. And I think that is a positive thing. At least it's a neutral thing. It's not a negative thing. It's something that when you think about a character or a game, it brings you into a moment that is sort of indistinct of any given point in that game. And that's something else I would like to mention, is that a bond is indistinct of any given moment. So while you might have formed a bond with some player or something you're watching because of some specific play they did, or because something in their history syncs with you in some way or whatever, the bond ultimately is when you think about them, you think about that player as a body, and it brings you to those experiences as a body, all their plays, all their other things you've otherwise gone through by watching them. And that, in the sense of God of War, is when I think about the moveset in particular, is that it's indistinct to any given... Even, I think most of the games have a similar iteration of that moveset. Like, I don't even think of a specific title when I think of that, which is, that's good, right? That's something that had a driving force that drove you to think about that. And it's a really basic example, but that is definitely one that sort of stands out to me. Another that I might think about is actually Aichao Aniki, which is a wonderful side-scrolling shooter with some very distinct elements in it. And I think of Aichao Aniki less from a player perspective, but more as a broad experience perspective. It's something that I may not immediately think of when I think of shmups, because I more or less go to archetype for that. Aichao Aniki is viewed more or less as like a joke project. But it kind of stood out to me in a lot in that they really went out of their way to make a complete experience with it, even though it's a joke project. And it's certainly a very distinct, standout experience. And there was a bond in a sense that even though I didn't really spend much time with it at all until I was able to fully clear it, when I think about it, there is, like, I don't really have too many complaints about that game. And I think about the body of the experience as a whole of is if you were interested in shooters, these side-scrolling shooters, or shmups in general, you should definitely experience this game. And just like the subject material in general, with like the eggplants and the men and the wrestlers and the music and stuff like that, obviously it fits our core theater of comedy quite well. So
Sure.
it really synced with us in general. It, like in that sense, you formed a bond with an experience as opposed to any given specific name. And I think that's in general how you would also approach an RTS. With an RTS, you certainly can have it be player character driven, in the sense that you can have a character like Raynor or Kerrigan, but you can't really bring them into the gameplay in a fluid manner that really works that well, because heroes just don't work in RTSs at all. And even if you do bring in heroes into it, it often ends up like Warcraft 3, where they're a crutch really more than anything. You end up sort of destroying the whole process of the bonding and stuff like that, and the efforts of bringing them in, which means that building an RTS bond thing really depends upon the body of the experience as a whole.
Yeah.
And that's obviously a very complicated formula to get right. Obviously, many people have tried, and they haven't succeeded. When we think about something like Dark Souls, really, like, with the bonds in it, that brings us to customization. I think that you will form more bonds in the sense of having more, like when you talk about these games, you obviously have a character creator, you have different armor and weapons and stuff like that, but there's not actually really much customization in these games. I think Elderp Ring is the first of the series to introduce any manner to even change what equipment looks like, and it's like really item specific too. It's like some alteration system. And other than that, you will still have people where they do what they say they play Fashion Souls, where they only use really specific stuff to look a really specific way, and maybe fit like their headcanon of what their character is. Like there's a lot of headcanon stuff that goes with these games, where they're sort of like trying to role play out that their character is some other part of this world. And then that's their way of forming a bond with it. So you do see a lot of exploration of stuff like that. That's definitely something that I've never personally gotten into, but I've certainly seen it. And I mean, even in that context, we sort of breach into the subject of D&D and forming bonds in D&D. And that's another major thing. Actually, that's a super major thing that I could probably talk for hours about, because of finishing the Auto Win project and how much of an emotional response that actually provoked from me that was completely unexpected, actually. But also some of the feedback I've gotten from the NPCs in that game and how I run NPCs in that game. And I seem to have been able to establish very strong grounds for designing NPCs and characters. For me, like, I guess one of the reasons why I approach this with the bonds and why I think of this way, it may not even really be the greatest way of wording this concept in general. It's how I view it. And it's just because I'm a long form writer. I don't really do short form writing. I'm good at script writing and I'm good at dialogue, but I can't really do spot writing with descriptions in particular. So, say for example, when I wrote out scripts for my earlier Unreal projects or for my StarCraft 2 projects, it was just all dialogue. I had a blurb of like 1 to 2 sentences that described the map and what the objectives were, because it's always just basically like, this is an RTS map because it's going to be an RTS map. These are the opponents, these are your allies, these are the conditions for that changing. And then I might divide the script based on the events that happen and then have the dialogue that would be playing with that. So for me, building the bonds in terms of just the scripts was done exclusively through just these dialogue. And then it was insinuated there'd be gameplay along with this or in between it, or however I choose to segment it. And with dialogue alone in D&D, for the most part, as I described in one of the earlier casts, is, again, I'm weak in descriptive writing. So I try to rely more on physical graphics assets to get ideas across for me, especially like the maps and the unit tokens. But then we also have sessions that are 5-6 hours long of nothing but talking constantly. They're called tavern sessions. And it can be with, like, I can be with an NPC and I can be talking to one player and we can just go back and forth for hours. And with the NPC, of course, you want each character to be distinct and unique. And I think some people, especially people that I'm familiar with, they really struggle to separate the personalities and ground like non-player personalities into a game. And I really just approach it from the believability standpoint. And the believability, again, To establish a bond, you have to be able to believe that there is, in the concept of tribulations, that there is a tribulation, that there is a struggle. Things have to look dangerous, look challenging. When you're struggling with something, it has to look and feel like it's a struggle. So this is one of the reasons why I hate stat systems in general.
Yeah.
And I will reference this in many places, is numbers are invisible. So, let's say, for example, in Diablo 3, since we were talking about Diablo, you can have a complete item build, or you can have a non-complete item build, or things can be socketed in a different way. It doesn't change what your stuff looks like. But the numbers that coming out are going to be exponentially higher in one and the other. And the same will go for monsters with level scaling, like in Skyrim. With my Skyrim run, there's just random bandits and shit that'll run up and just fucking one-shot me out of nowhere. They're just wearing like fur and shit. And I'm in like full Daedric armor or whatever. Or I'm using like special mod armor that's even more powerful than the high-end armor normal. The scaling and stuff like that, it just shreds all sense of what expectations were established earlier in the game and what stuff physically looks like it should behave like. So in order to establish the idea that you, as a player character, as an entity within the game world, are facing tribulations, they should look like they're actually tribulations. They should physically feel like they're tribulations. The RTS genre has failed in this so spectacularly, with all this shit like pre-placed idling units, AI that doesn't defend, the basic shit that breaks you away from the whole concept of the RTS, which the second you step into multiplayer and you play against a human player of an even very low skill level, just the fundamental ability to think suddenly makes for a much more broad and encompassing canvas to tell a story with. Now you have a story between two players versus a story that's not much of a story. That's just like a point note of a player spent this much time grinding through 800 food of pre-placed units that occasionally spawned like 5 Zerglings every 20 minutes.
Well, the thing there is it goes a step further, because sometimes character resolutions and deaths are handled in ways that are completely discordant with what you're actually doing. So it's obviously like the pre-play stuff is an example, but it's also like, imagine the last mission of the original 3 campaigns is Tassadar 9/11 himself into the Overmind after you've wiped the entire map and he's not taken a point of damage. So
yeah.
You just get stupid situations where there's a complete disconnect in terms of how the writing resolves something that the player was really responsible for at the end of the day.
Well, it brings us to the whole thing where, like, you use a quick time event to kill an enemy.
Yeah, or a cutscene.
It's like, you went through all the work to defeat the boss after an hour and a half. Now you're going to push a button and the game's going to kill him for you.
Yeah.
Or push many buttons in the case of Zeus. Jesus fucking Christ.
A lot of buttons and very quickly.
Many random buttons.
Yeah. What really gets me about that specific example of characters or plot elements being resolved in a cutscene is, like, I've tried to say this stuff before to people, and I'm not sure. There's probably the best way to word it, and I haven't found it yet. But it's basically like, if there's a cutscene and it's not being used to establish something that maybe works best in a cutscene in that respect, and it's actually being used to resolve and finish something, that's probably a case where the cutscene is not being leveraged correctly. That's a scene in a movie. That's a scene in a book, maybe. But in a video game, the player is the one who should be doing the resolution. It's their actions that are bringing about this change, unless it's some sort of bizarro game where the player is just playing the part of a cameraman and the game resolves itself, which I guess is describing an ever-increasing number of titles these days. But that's not what most games are, and certainly not what I would argue games really excel at. Is the whole idea is that you're supposed to be able to do that. It kind of goes back to the discussion of bonding over an experience as opposed to a specific character or even a specific element in particular. I thought you contrasted it quite well, because you referenced like a specific moment and how you had like this bond with Kratos that sort of extended across multiple installations or installments of the franchise. And you were specifically just talking about like cornering enemies, whereas that is a mechanic or a consistent like element of how you played the game, and that's something that's downstream of your experience with the title, as opposed to something where it's a moment, which just by definition probably always happened, probably always happened for all players. It's a moment in a story, a segment of a plot, a big resolution to something that happened. If ultimately that moment is, essentially how the player overcame an obstacle and finally defeated the big bad, and ideally it's not handled in a cutscene like we were just talking about, then that moment happens for all players who completed that level. And so it's not going to be, the path to get there is what's going to be different. The actual resolution is not, or at least in most titles, we would imagine it's not going to be distinct. So that's where I think you can probably start to think about how you would contrast these moments versus these experiences, these high points in a narrative or a plot that are probably going to be looked at fondly. Really, one of the main ways that you can make them memorable is not by it's not just by making the moment satisfying in terms of synchronized music and all this other stuff, right? Those go a long way to making that satisfying, but the experience of getting to that point is what the player actually does, and that's probably, I would imagine, where you would want to focus most of your attention within an RTS title, like you were saying. Another point you brought up actually was the whole hero thing, and the hero, for me, the thing that becomes really discordant with forming this bond between player and game is the character is supposed to simultaneously be a hero and a commander most of the time. Or at least one of if you have more than one hero, God help you, then one of them is supposed to be calling the shots at some point, right? Or I guess in StarCraft, it's like the player character, which is just its own sort of silliness.
Well, it almost makes sense in StarCraft when you have the Executor.
Yeah.
And the Cerebrets and these nameless characters that the player is self-inserted as. But then they retcon that out, and then the whole thing falls to pizzazz.
Yeah. And I think I have a strong aversion to these ideas of viewport characters precisely because they are these amorphous, like, vague entities that really only exist as a way to, like, a lazy way for the player to be an insert. Whereas if you instead had, like, Raynor being the character of the first campaign instead of some magistrate, if you instead had, I don't know, Phoenix or somebody being the central character of the Protoss campaign or whatever, then that, I think, goes a farther direction towards, like, the player themselves are making all of these decisions and moves and military victories. That's... If you could imagine a character doing all of those things instead of a not character, an explicitly not character, then you could probably imagine that there would be more synchronicity between what the events, what events happened in the plot versus like what the characters themselves were actually doing. Because most of the time the characters are just off screen somewhere doing nothing, and we're just given some, like, if anything, sometimes not even this, we're given establishing, dialogue as to what they're doing. Like, you think of the Brood War campaign, you think of when you're supposedly you have this 10,000 mineral starting advantage and you're leading this assault on a desert planet, and it's like you're just by yourself against 3 blobs of stupid enemies that aren't doing anything.
Yeah, 3 immobile blobs that just cover the entire map.
Yeah. And here's Raynor and Phoenix and Mensk, and apparently they're assaulting outerlying strongholds that you never see. And it's like, well, that's like probably the weakest way you could have accounted for their involvement in the story. Obviously, heroes themselves aren't super great, because the point I was making when I was bringing up the idea that they're supposed to, often they're simultaneously calling the shots, but also being there on the battlefield. Not only does that not sound like a great plan strategically, because if your hero dies, then you lose everything, unless Warcraft 3. But even with Warcraft 3 as the example, it starts to muddy what that entity in the story actually experienced, because they're simultaneously casting Divine Shield and beating a troll in the corner, and also leading this military campaign against, all the way into Northrend and into the top of the world or whatever. Like these things by definition are really hard to square anyway, even when you're just dealing with the commander part, because there's probably going to be some, silly AI thing that will be immersion breaking that you'll have tried very hard to minimize, but not been able to succeed entirely. And you're already going to have cases where that shit can pop up. You don't want to add to it the idea that you somehow have to resolve the experience of whoever the hero is being the primary commander at the same time, because now they're supposed to account for both what the player experienced and what that unit did in the game. And it's just good luck ever getting that wrangled correctly, besides all of the unsavory gameplay ramifications or implications.
Yeah, when I was writing scripts for pretty much any of these projects, is the player assumes the role of a player character, and everything related to them, is, if they speak, is done in first person. So in Apex for StarCraft 2, when you play as Al-Khazir, a lot of elements that were basically tutorials or starting text, or really there was like inner monologue for the character all over the place throughout the entire campaign, which is just the character talking to himself, and then that is used to usually drive information in some shape or fashion. So that was one of the ways that I established grounding for the player character being a specific character. But also, when you have these externalized characters like Raynor, and then you have the nebulous player character that is either named or not named, but the player's accomplishments ultimately are not really like the focus, which is the case for StarCraft and Brood War and StarCraft 2, is, for one, it obviously waters down the player's ultimate involvement in how the game world progresses. But it also waters down the heroes and the individual characters' involvement as well, not just in terms of the story, because, well, the player knows that Raynor didn't, overwhelm all these units and command 10,000 minerals worth of 3 hatcheries because 3, and do all this other shit because Raynor spent most of the map stuck inside of his base, because if he died, the mission would just end.
Yeah.
And, or in the case of StarCraft 2, the player knows that Kerrigan died 50 times trying to kill this one fucking unit in the map, and just conveniently respawned in her hatchery every single time because very convenient. The player knows this stuff. You can write the story any way you want, but that's ultimately not going to be the same thing the player experienced, and the player will always be thinking, yeah, well, the map really didn't quite play out quite the way you are saying in the end-game dialogue. So there's this immediate disconnect. And it also is just even the process of none of the silly stuff happens. The player being disconnected from the character means that there's no threads linking the accomplishments of the actual character in the story. It's not Raynor conquering space to unite with his lost love, Fuda Kerrigan. It's Raynor enlisting the help of somebody to help him do all this stuff. And then all the dialogue and related drama in the story is focused on Raynor, and you, the invisible magistrate, never receive or partake in any of this drama whatsoever. And then you just disappear when any of the actual story important events take place. Like, for example, Kerrigan receiving the Fuda. So it's just right off the bat, right off the get-go, it was just a terrible idea to do that. Retconning it was absolutely not the way to bail out of it. But, Blizzard never really had any story writers inside their company, so unfortunate, but that's...
They call him the lore master and also the war chief. Wasn't it? Wait, am I suffering from dementia, or did he actually name his D&D company War Chief?
Didn't he?
Isn't that a real
thing? Thought he did.
Yeah.
I gotta wonder what kind of a mess his D&D stuff is. I actually have been sent Blizzard licensed D&D, or at least tabletop content that I have not looked at yet. Blizzard actually did make stuff for this, and I imagine it's something to do with medicine. I've been too scared to look at it, but I haven't, and I just know it's probably some kind of rumblings for what kind of just tragic disaster that Metzen scraped. What probably happened is he did get ousted out of Blizzard. They basically fired him, and he retired, quote unquote, because people who literally do nothing and print money just decide to retire randomly, and that's why they call VTuber expelling graduation. It's just political correct speak for saying we found a way to automate everything you do with a JavaScript, so we're not going to pay you and deplete our salary anymore. And Metzen realized he cannot fund Prozac and booze binges off of the leavings that he was left behind with his severance. So he went back to apparently what he did inside the office, which was coerce people into playing D&D. And I at the same time, there's just this curiosity I have is just how bad is it really? Because it's got to be horrible.
How long does it take him to tap into the void? That's the question, right?
I mean, I assume that every session starts with him just broadening his prolapse and sucking people into it. And then it's like the Dragon Strike narrator where you just got the guy in black against the black background, but it's the inside of his asshole, and he starts talking with a husky voice. I am the war chief.
Dude, he is. I can't.
And he gets out
If
his
the
foam
story
mallet.
that designer Dave tells is true, though, that's so fucking insane. Why would he? Does he like think he's character acting or something? Like just walking up the fucking cubicle aisles, going, "I am the war chief."
Hey man, it's a lot like Rockstar's. Fame is a hell of a drug, along with all the alcohol they were binge drinking in that office.
Jeez.
We've got that video of them fucking chair jousting when they should have been developed.
Well, I don't know how you can possibly get any more invested in the saga of Blizzard. Talk about a bond, but I wanted to ask you a little bit more directly about the characters. You referenced when you were doing D&D stuff. You were talking about the conclusion to Autumn Wind and similar related topics. One of the things that was brought up is you feel like you've built. I think your words were something about like a fundamental method of designing these NPC characters such that they can be engaged with and bonds can be formed across enough time. So I kind of have like a two-pronged question, which is like part one is almost three. Part one is like, how much time do you believe it takes to like for the kinds of characters you want to write? Is it? I imagine it's probably a bit of a complex answer for that one, but like, how long do you think those bonds take to form, or when do you feel like by this point the player should start to feel something, even if it's not completely there yet? And then also like, how do you actually go about designing these characters so that these bonds will be formed? But I feel like it's also kind of a thing about sort of like how trust is like hard to build up but easy to break. It's like these bonds are easy to have fall apart if you go the wrong way. So it's like a stay the course thing. How do you design at first from the ground up, but then also make sure that there's not some deviation down the line that will cause the bond to start to break or shatter?
It's different for everything. It is definitely not an answer I can give broadly speaking.
Okay.
But again, with the believability perspective, one of the approaches I take up is that less is more. So just in general, an observation is that while people may have wordy dialogue personalities, they may talk a lot, usually when confronted with strangers or stuff like that, you will have what I would call the probing phase. And I'm not just talking about the ancient aliens anally probing you, but a probing phase, you'll find that a lot of people will sort of hide their autism until they realize that they can just gush it all out at once. So when it comes to establishing a bond, believing that a character is genuine is important. Which means that typically when, let's say, for example, a player is meeting an NPC, unless the NPC has a particular reason to monologue or rant at them, which is the case for some of the enemies, even in such cases where a lot of the times they meet an enemy, like they met one of the most major enemies in the game, who basically like gave them like, I don't know, 3 or 4 lines of text before saying, I will not grant you death, and then they were sent into a multi-session battle against cosmic horrors. With a case of like a non-hostile NPC, you will usually enter a conversation point, which is like a probing and explorative phase where they won't be very wordy right away. And maybe as a result of a shy personality in one hand, but even for a more talkative personality, you will usually find people who do not do much other than, say, very short, small talk, perhaps, in some respects, or very objective-oriented talk in others. To actually build bonds with characters is something that absolutely requires in-game context for a lot of stuff. So, one of the things you take a concession with D&D is typically, at least I, try not to talk so much as to crowd out the player dialogue with NPC dialogue, but there are many cases where, especially when it's like they're talking to an NPC, you're going to end up running out wordy descriptions, wordy dialogue altogether, and you can end up talking quite a lot. And then you might also have cases where NPCs are talking between each other, but usually you feel the pressure to be fairly concise to get the ball back in the player's court. Or sometimes using dialogue as a means to drag in other players. Usually what happens when you have a dialogue between an NPC and you've got a group of 4 or 5 players, is 1 or 2 players will sort of take the lead, and the rest of them will kind of just backseat themselves and let the conversation play out. So something I try to do with the NPC is to, if I see an opening, I'll try to hook in non-vocal players into the dialogue when I can. And that in itself kind of can open up bond forming as well, because if you can do this in a natural way that really stands out in some manner, like with Autumn Wind, our player, I say a roster of rejects is kind of what our player character party looked like. They were all very strange individuals, with the most sane person basically screeching and ranting about crane flies half the time. And of course, you've got the fact that the player characters have sludged through all kinds of insane battlefields, in all kinds of insane conditions. Everything they're wearing is drenched in blood and oil and burnt and cut up and shit like that. There's always some kind of like small talk conversation marker or something you can, based on their state of attire, the way they look, the way they smell, or anything like that, and you can use that to kind of bounce off dialogues. And or in cases you may not make note about that. Maybe the NPC will be apathetic towards their clearly. You can even make sometimes even go as far as to make a descriptive note that says, this NPC really doesn't seem to take note of your current abysmal state of attire, or the blood that you're covered in, or the fact that you are half dead. Like, they're just dead. And then that immediately builds a connection where a player will sense, well, I guess the NPC is not moved by all the blood and violence in the world, or they're already dead inside, or something like that. So bonds are something that are built through an accumulation of experiences in this sense. It's something that can't be forced. And that's the thing I would probably point out first and foremost, is those slow little pieces, the small talk, the building up, the breaking of the ice, so to speak. That will go a long ways to building a bond. Building a bond with a character, an NPC, stuff like that, it's something that cannot be done in short order, I don't think. Sometimes you'll end up in a case where some event happens that immediately strikes a really powerful memory, and then that will resound out for a long time. But usually when you're planning it out, you can't anticipate this stuff. I mean, sometimes you're introducing an NPC in a certain circumstance where, there's going to be something insane that happens and immediately forms a bond. Like in the main campaign, I have a 5th player who's playing an NPC who is very, very forgetful. And he immediately starts the game by basically being absolutely insane. He shows up while they're in this state of confusion because they were thrust into a new area that's very insane and confusing, and this guy is also insane and confusing, and he's the first NPC they encounter in that area. So that's more of a heavy-handed approach where everything is insane, and here's a focus point of insanity, and we draw a lot of attention to this focus point quite early in. In most cases, you don't get that. So you want to build your nuances in as you go. For how long it can take, if we say our average session is 5 hours, I can say probably about 15-20 hours to build a very fundamental NPC bond, like an NPC that travels with the party, let's say. Sometimes we can do it faster, again, very contextually sensitive. But generally speaking, when the players are talkative and they're engaged with a bunch of stuff, there's a lot of resolutions going on. In many cases, there's not a lot of cases for the NPC to open up or be explored. There will be exceptions. For example, if there's sort of an interrogation situation going on, that can open up a lot. You look for opportunities to sort of allow the NPC to explore. There was an NPC that was introduced in the Autumn Wind who is Arabet. And Arabet is actually one of the main antagonists of the main campaign, and pretty much everybody knows who he is. But Autumn Wind is a precursor. A very, very, very early beginnings of the world precursor versus the main campaign that's at the end of the world. And Arabet in this is completely different. When he introduces himself as Arabet, there's some hints to his identity before he does that, and then that kind of breadcrumbs us, and the players that a character know who he is. And I know, as the DM and as somebody who's played with these players and knowing all the game context and everything related, that people are going to be thinking, that this is this character or related to him just by how I describe him, if I describe it too literally. So I build up to it. So that's a part of my bond building process before we even get to the process of actually introducing the character, is if I start describing the violet lights or the way his eyes are, or the mood around him, or even reveal what he looks like, because he's sort of an edgy, like purple violet color kind of character. And if I show that off, this is a very distinctive look, because there's really only one character within SS who carries this kind of color palette. So this kind of goes on an earlier thing you were mentioning before of specific heroes having specific kinds of colors.
Yeah.
Well, Violet is this guy's thing. He's literally called the Violet King. So if I start describing it immediately this way, then we're going to give that away. But I kind of build up to it, and then we reveal it. And this was done in such a case where, because of his different personality, which was very sort of passive, but non-confrontational and polite, while also treating stuff very differently as you might expect someone of his caliber to do so. He was basically they find him in a dungeon, but he's there of his own will, because he was politely asked to be there, and he feels obligation to the guy that found him and helped him out and stuff like that, even though this guy's more than powerful enough to break free, do anything he wants at this point. And there was like a bunch of monsters that were elsewhere inside the prison. They didn't aggro them or open up the cages to release them. And they're like, are you aware there's other things in here? And he's like, yeah, they keep me company. So he ends up telling them bits and pieces about the area that they're in, which was a huge church, as they're going through it afterwards. And he kind of follows them around and helps them a little bit. And through that, then they explore his character in some senses as well, because they know what he becomes. They don't know what he is now or why he's so different now, out of character. So in that sense, I'm kind of playing their expectations and subverting them based on what they come into the knowledge they come into the game with, while also using him as a way to give information about the area that they didn't otherwise have to advance their understanding of it, and then also establishing this character as its own independent thing at the same time. So that ended up being really successful. People ended up becoming really involved with him, and eventually it turns out that he is basically, what he is at this point is he is a possessed sword. And there is the Emperor that forged that sword. He was a water god that was the Emperor's friend way back. And in the final battle, they managed to, they end up not killing the Emperor, even though he really tried to kill them and failed spectacularly. And then he ends up getting revived because of other shit that they did. A lot of moons sort of aligned. They ticked all the good feels checkboxes and saving a lot of stuff. And he eventually comes back armed with a sword, and he helps them out in the final battle and deals a lot of damage, and really helps them secure a victory in what would have otherwise been a very, very difficult fight. So there was like a long-term game progression for him. And ultimately, in the end game resolutions, they encounter Erebit. And this is when he becomes a not very good guy. He kind of goes insane. It's a long story, but he kind of goes insane, and 3 of the player characters end up getting turned into vampires. And that's their end-game resolution, as they eventually get put on ice and they get turned into vampires because of this guy. And that's the turning point for him. So the time it took to establish that for him, we encountered him at the end of a session, but I firmly believe that within the session after that, within just a couple of hours, we had already a very strong... It was a very strong character, a very strong introduction, and there was very, very little combat or anything involved with it for the most part. It was just the mood. We struck all the right chords with the mood. The character was preluded to a little bit. There was some foreshadowing for him with a boss that they killed prior, and that was another major character that talked about Subject 2. Subject 2's blood has made me a god. I've researched all this stuff from this visitor, and he called him a visitor from another world. So there was lots of little abstract things. With each NPC like this, there's going to be small major NPCs that are not very vocal and not super massive, but still serve a lot to drive the energy of the world. That's the way I view Erebit, where he was a major character, but to me he was very small, because he was like a side character in this. You just as easily could have even actually killed him at that point. But the impact that he made was really about how the players drove their interaction with him, because they really interacted with him. And then, of course, again, with the endgame resolution, they came back to him actually several times. So they reinforce things on their own initiative, and that's really, I think, one of those main things with the NPC is to have a successful point is to drive something where the players are going to want to come back to them. And I remember asking the players fairly early in which what was their favorite NPCs. I remember someone saying, "My favorite NPCs are the ones I fucked with the most." So even just from very basic reviews, it's like the bonds can take a while to form, but so long as there's a drive to interact with them, then even the simplest NPCs will eventually form bonds as a result of that.
Yeah, you paint it almost as if it's an inevitability that it will happen, so long as certain things hold true, and that holding true part is the interesting one, or one of the most interesting aspects is like how you ensure that. It also, your discussion of the Violet King reminded me of, or made me think of like whether you could construe bonds themselves as almost having a fractal nature to them, where obviously in this case it is the same character, but it's also not the same character. It's across such wide swaths of time. And so there's an expectation there that is being subverted, like you mentioned, but there still is enough unique about the character in this moment that it's like, in many ways, the bond has to be re-examined based on what they already know. And probably, I assume, would allow them to then apply what they learned from this experience to the bond that they already had with the original incarnation of the character that they had experienced. And I feel like it's probably similar to, so there's like the fractal nature aspect of it comes to play when you're imagining that by virtue of connecting with a specific person, and I feel like this is easy to map onto regular real life experience. If you form a bond with a character and then that character has a rival, you're much more predisposed to disliking that rival in terms of the way that you express your appreciation for a character, right? And not necessarily in a sense where you think they're a bad character, just you don't like them because the character that you've bonded with doesn't like them, or perhaps it's more nuanced than that. But that's like one way to think about it. I feel like this could be mapped on as well to not just characters, but also like more broad terms.
When you're saying that, what I'm thinking of is an FFA and StarCraft. Your approach to which targets to focus on in an FFA. That's what that brings up to me.
Yeah, well, it's like the game theoretic of right now my closest neighbor is probably the most threatening, but that's going to change the more the more times I strike against this guy and keep him reduced in terms of his military strength. There's another person out there who's not receiving this attention from me, and therefore I can't guarantee that they're not building up in absolute solitude. And which is precisely
or it's
what
the
happened.
Devil you know versus the devil you don't.
Yeah. So there's definitely a connection from a gameplay standpoint. I was thinking of races, and within an RTS context, you have like there's a really lame and not really well articulated aspect of this in StarCraft originally, where supposedly the Protoss and the Zerg were engineered by the same master race, and they are different parts of a greater whole or something. And you can kind of think that, like, well, if you really like Protoss, maybe you don't like Zerg by extension, but usually that doesn't end up happening the way that maybe the writers intended or whatever. But I suppose another example would just be Terrans. They're human. We know humans. Maybe we're more predisposed to forming a bond with people that are essentially us in the future. That could also be thought of that way. I was thinking in a setting I'm working on, there's a race of sun worshippers that inadvertently create another, it's not really a race, but it's a machine consciousness that ends up going, you could say goes rogue in some capacity. But that one of the ways that this machine consciousness plays off of them is that it deliberately perverts their symbols of worship and the things that are culturally significant to them. Their sigil is like a sublime depiction of a sun, and it's actually meant to evoke this strong emotional attachment from the original creators, just so that they can then despair when it's revealed to not be an allied state. It's revealed to be their mistakes, basically the misbegotten machines that they created, unwittingly. And it's like if you end up being attached to one or the other, you're probably going to be predisposed to not really vibing with the other guys on the other end of the spectrum, because they are these diametrically opposed entities, and it's reflected even in their art design and what kinds of technologies they deploy and what kinds of tactics they're specialized at. Whereas one of them is the original inventors have tried to turn themselves into these sorts of you could say charitable or philanthropic entities that try to almost safeguard and preserve stability across the cosmos. The other one is just hell bent on domination across the whole sector. So you could imagine that as being, these are obviously, completely opposed viewpoints, but that's going to lead to very different technology. And hopefully the fact that they're sort of similar, but in terms of the visuals, but like almost up to an absurd degree in terms of how celebratory they become of what the original creators liked, just almost for the pure specific example or purpose of mocking them and belittling them and reducing their significance in that respect, and driving them to despair. That's one of the things where I think you can take that, and if you do form a bond with one or the other, you're naturally going to have that fractal connection with the other because of the fact that it's so close. It's like a character who's got a love interest or a character who's got a rival in a competition. It's very easy to see why you might have a different experience or different feeling about other characters in the same setting or other races in the RTS context, just based on how those connections are there once you have a connection to begin with.
Well, that's why you see every anime opens up with the high school setting.
Yeah.
And the characters, because they're trying to establish a bond with their target audience.
Right.
They try to establish that ground level of something you can identify with. That's what a lot of these productions try to do to establish these bonds, is having the identifiable main character. And in a lot of these cases, it really misses the mark because, like say the Transformers reboots, people aren't here to watch, generic white male man with his fucking college or whatever. They're here to watch giant robots, and the fast cuts away from giant robots. This is one of the many. I mean, the reboots in general are all a disaster end to end, but the philosophy behind the direction of the character focus in general is all completely off the mark, which means that it's one of those focus marketed things that's like, it's always been done this way. This is how we've always established bonds. It's by having our main character be someone who you could feasibly be in our main audience. And in some senses, that definitely does have merit. But I like to think of it as interaction. Again, interaction concepts being that core identifier. So all of my worlds are pretty abstract. I mean, with Apex, you're usually starting with a Terran-oriented faction. And that in itself kind of grounds you in a very similar way. But then you quickly realize that whole setting is very different. So with, say, for example, Black Sun, the Machinima, the Anan are very similar to Terrans in some visual aesthetic sense. You can view them at, but they're actually lizards. So they're not really at all. But the colors and the shapes and stuff like that are feasibly sort of like an industrial cosmic thing that you might see within like StarCraft or Warhammer or something like that with the Imperial Guard or Space Marines, and you can draw those connections. And that sense of believability, that's what we started with, and we established a ground so that when we advance forward to Zychronasha and the Undead and all these really exotic things, we have a starting point to compare them to, and then we can draw bonds between what we have, where we've grounded something and we have a stable footing, to the things that are very different, and then we have a contrast of what makes them very different even within our setting. So each individual thing kind of has to be addressed on its own footing. But when I think about, like with the RTS and stuff, I think about with the interaction. And the symbology and stuff like that's definitely an important one too. When you were talking about the sun symbol, it actually made me think about the Anan, because the Anan first fight the Undead, and the Undead are all about they have overwhelming power, and that overwhelming power could be just as easily used to just smash everything in their way and really not have too many problems, especially at this point in time. But what they instead do is they end up, the Anan have these ships with these blades and these they're massive, like 20 kilometer to 100,000 plus kilometer long ships. They're huge, and they're all decorated in these sweeping blades and these fake bridges, and they build all these silhouettes and stuff like that, and they resemble royal palaces, specifically the royal fleet. And it's all about having an image and invoking this image of royal, of authority, of divine authority. And the Undead end up with a Maruk fleet, the Turin fleet. When the first Undead show up to start attacking them, they have these same shapes, but they're all riddled. Like, you can almost think of it as like the Dark Eldar versus the Eldar,
Okay.
or the Chaos Space Marines versus the Space Marines. With the exception of the Undead, they're really, really, really different. Their surface material is like gazing into, how would I even describe it? They're not metal or anything like that. They're really strange, but the general shapes and silhouettes are sort of similar. And, it's a very similar idea. You have one and the other, and they're very polarized in many different ways. And all the way down to just how the silhouettes are done to intentionally polarize the royal appearance and to kind of pervert it in a manner.
Yeah.
So that is more of a classic kind of thing, and it definitely can work quite well. And then we might have, another contrast to that, which is like the Dieth Jin, which are a machine race. They're machine demons, actually. And their ships are all riddled in these super long antennae, and they're pretty much all function over form. So although they have forms that are kind of aggressive looking, they're not like the Undead. They're not like the Zykernash. They're not like the Anan. They don't really go out of the way to flower stuff. They're very technical, and with a long antenna all over the place, those are basically shield generators. And they strike like a very, I would say, like a robotic appearance, but not really, not in a classical sense. A very artificial appearance, you can say. So it's still alien in its own manner, but you can view them as being very fundamentally different than everything else. Not just in how they appear, but why they appear differently too. Their character looks very different and very technical versus being very boisterous or, flamboyant. And there's not really, like, at that point in that production, the Zykernash are organic ships, but they're also sort of flamboyant. The Undead are pretty much just all like either horrific effigies or some kind of bastardization of something. And the Anan keep up their royal appearances all the way up until the 4th generation, where it becomes more technical and then somewhat flamboyant. And then you have the Dieth Jin that really just kind of stand apart in the midst of everything in all their appearances. So it's just the way that things look can absolutely tell a story. And then that prose will, like, one of the things about bonds that is really important to building a bond. I was saying that it can take a long time to build a bond, but there is one aspect to this that you really also have to consider, which is first impressions. First impressions shape a lot of the groundwork for the long road afterwards. If the first impressions are a certain thing and they are opposed to the experience that then comes afterwards, then that experience has to work a lot harder to establish the kind of bond that you would feel good. Like, let's say, for example, you met a guy who seemed like kind of a dick. That's the experience that most people have with me, is I am very blunt and upfront, and I'm no bullshit, and I'm development oriented, and I don't like to beat around the bush or whatever. I like honesty and communication, and a lot of people just can't handle that, and as a result they get off put by that, or they bottle up or something like that. And at the end of the day, with all these examples I can think of, is we all basically just want the same thing out of whatever time we're doing together, playing games, enjoying games, building games, whatever. And it takes a long time for them to actually realize that, because they came up with all these strange ideas, and they don't ever vocalize these ideas because they think that I will not react to it in a constructive manner. When it really comes down to, like, they don't know how to propose things in a non-confrontational manner that would, provoke some kind of response. Because usually when, this is obviously something everybody who would be familiar with, is the whole idea of criticizing stuff. And I have been a critic of Blizzard since Warcraft 3, and my criticism with Blizzard has always been as a result of first-person experience. I have had first-person experience. I've dealt with Blizzard in their forums and with their products, and everything I've ever bitched about them is something that has come from my experience building shit with their games since 1998 and dealing with their official responses and their bullshit. And I have had an intimate understanding of their products for years and years and years prior to really getting vocal about how much they're fucking shit up and how much of a mess everything is becoming, especially in Warcraft 3. And all these bad decisions that they're making were plain as day to me. And when I vocalized that, people thought I was insane at the best of times. And the worst of times, I would get banned from websites for suggesting that people allow staff to have news posting access because it was an easy excuse to silence dissent. And, you know, ultimately everything I said would come true anyways, and people would be like, oh, I guess you were right all along. Like, say, StarCraft 2, for example. I pretty much predicted StarCraft 2 to a T to be an absolute blithering failure in custom content where everybody who is serious about it would bail. Well, look at where we're at today. It's precisely what happened.
Hey, man,
And-
Oracle's serious.
Yeah, Oracle is about as serious as Metzen was, I guess. He's what a goddamn embarrassment. What a goddamn... I'm absolutely glad that he turned out to be so bad at communication. He couldn't even give me anything to do. Because I would feel so ashamed if I was associated with that project any more than it was. He couldn't even be asked to show whatever fools he paid. I guess I can't really call them fools because they cashed in, and he was the one who was played for a fool with that kind of quality. Whoever he paid to build the content for that shit heap, he never directed them towards the information that I assembled for him on how to export and configure assets for StarCraft 2, because holy fuck, it's a blithering disaster. That's all that game has to show for over a decade. It's just a shame. And you know, at the end of the day, like even like Chris, for example, you remember when Chris decided after like 2 years to bump that thread on CC where I said something that was like Trump's policies appear reasonable if he actually goes through with them, and Chris just like had this meltdown. I mean, he really obviously didn't even read my post, and what ultimately happened is like 50 fucking people come into the forum to berate him or laugh at him to some extent. And then like sometime after, like a month or something, or some weeks after, he sent me a DM. And I explained to him why people did this, and why we responded the way we did, and why people were not happy with him taking other people's projects and shit. And it seemed to actually register to him. Like, he seemed to actually suddenly realize, oh, wait, you know, I approached this from the wrong mindset, and, you know, that makes sense why people were angry and stuff like that. I mean, he went on to continue doing it anyways. He just didn't post about it on CC anymore. But
no,
I think
he did it in another forum instead. So.
Yeah, he understood at that point why people were pissed with him.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think that if he had understood that from the beginning, he probably wouldn't have made his... I mean, I don't know why the hell he started that shit show to begin with, but at least he sort of in part understood why people took issue with his review process. If you could even call it that. But, you know, that's like just one encapsulated example of all these exchanges where it's like your first impression makes a big deal. Like, I've had to deal with this kind of rodeo for so many years where I try not to let a bad first impression really heavily color my resulting like analysis of something. Like, especially when it comes to like game software. But even with people in general. But the problem is that there's a lot of times where I am not harsh enough with a first impression. And that means that I might assume that somebody is more mature or more capable or more, let's just say, constructive minded than they really are going to turn out to be. And that is something that may not come to light for a long time. So even though I'm a hard ass, I still have a problem where I still end up taking things too leniently. And it's especially a problem with people, is I'm too lenient on people. I give people the benefit of the doubt much too often. And that has bit me in the ass actually quite a lot, especially in 2017. So...
yeah, you know what? This reminds me of, it's not really a topic that's super... it's related in terms of the fact that I'm going to use a callback, but I don't know how related it is in the grand scheme of things. But one of the things you mentioned when you were talking about the D&D characters is that you have this initial position where they're kind of feeling you out. They're deciding how much to share, whether they are even interested. Maybe they'll never be interested, or maybe like the things you'd have to do are very specific, and that's what that could contribute to like increasing the amount of time it takes to form that bond, or what have you. But there's going to be this period of time where nobody just goes to you and says, here's all of my shit, and now you know everything about me. Because that would just be a very poor way of communicating, and you wouldn't even retain most of the info, and you just think that the other person was really weird. So,
and that's why the Baldur's Gate reboots are shit.
Well, there you go. Yeah, it's like there needs to be time for any of what is said to be felt and to be real, and to be to feel like it actually lands at any point. I would analogize this to actual individuals, and in that it's probably a bit different for you and I. We have a lot of content. I guess yours is not public facing as much anymore, but we have a lot of these content where we're going onto these long form discussions, and we're publicating a lot of information. We're, writing game design documentation in my case, or blog posts, and like sort of, all these articles and stuff in your case. And we're putting our ideas out there in the world, and a lot of them are still publicly available in one shape or fashion. And so, on the one hand, just like we would like a D&D character in your case might be feeling out a player character to decide whether they're worth the time to actually go into detail about things, and whether they're worth the time to explain. I'm probably going to be the same way. I'm not going to be re-explaining every single thing that I've already said in many podcasts and many talk shows and many interviews and in many other forms of media that you can just go and freely consume yourself. Like, it feels like it would be a bit silly for me to just constantly restate myself. And maybe, I've thought about this before, like maybe it would be best to have like a video series that I just link people to when they give me the same annoying thing, and I just like solve that one for good, and then we don't have to worry about it anymore. Like when people are complaining about me not having microtransactions in my game plan, I think then you just get banned. But even if that's not the case, yeah, at least I'll have a video somewhere that you can look at. So like maybe that's a better solution, a more elegant solution to the problem. But I do feel this aversion to investing and engaging within just a random person who comes in. I don't know anything about them, but I assume that they've literally chosen to join a community where I'm like one of the founders. I'm the reason why the server is there, or whatever. And they're going to hop in here, and maybe they'll have their own opinions on things. But if they don't voice them, assuming that we actually know a thing or two, assuming that we've thought the things through, and assuming that we have a reason to be the way that we are, then they're obviously going to run into some stupid environments. And like when you were talking about trying to make sure that your first impression doesn't discolor your opinion too much, or doesn't make your opinion go too low, I guess in my current position, I'm almost in the opposite angle, where if you're going to ask me dumb questions, or if you're going to say things that are just covered everywhere else on the internet, then there's plenty of other places that are not enthusiast communities that care about quality and care about, the essence of what makes something great, that you can go to and sort of spurg out in. You don't need to do so in mine. And so I probably am less lenient in that particular respect, but I can also see the argument for that maybe, when these questions come through the door, it's better to answer them in some fashion. Even if it is a YouTube video link or something that just explains in 5 minutes or less why your question was stupid. If you can engage with them on some level and hopefully improve their understanding of the subject, or at least expose them to information of a counter position that they may not have considered, that's probably a better and more thorough way to make some change in people's minds, or at least allow them to make the decision themselves as to whether or not they agree and all that. So,
well, when it comes to information, I'm very similar to that. If anybody ever I've actually had a lot of people come to me with StarCraft questions over the years, and I say, like in recent times, I just say, go to your site and look there. Like I'm not involved with this anymore. I don't care about this anymore. I have no investment in somebody else's project. I know you're not going to finish it.
That's the best thing, is when people are asking for like design help or technical support of something, and it's like, come back to me when you've like figured out the answer to these really easy questions by going to my website or some other source, and when you have something that's much closer to being demonstrably complete. I remember a similar thing where you were saying publicly that like you would only consider even like offering to do voice acting for somebody's project if it was demonstrably close to completion and just needed the voice acting.
I've wasted a lot of time on that.
Yeah, because otherwise you just get silly situations.
Because like I had a number of projects, especially when I was on YouTube. I had a number of very interesting projects show up. And like for me, it didn't matter to me like what the project was. There was a project that appeared to be some kind of live action Sailor Moon alike thing made by people who were literally 14, 15 years old. And I was perfectly fine doing voicing for them because they had, at the time, they had what appeared to be some kind of grounding for completion. I actually really wanted to see it finished because I'm sure it was going to be absolutely goofy as all hell. Unfortunately, they all exploded, so that never happened. But, you know, in that sense, I've also turned down a lot of voicing for much larger projects because to me, the merit of something is based on like if you're approaching me with something that is very obviously like not something I have any evidence to believe is going to be completed, then there's absolutely no reason for me to waste time on it because there's a lot like Oracle, for example. I went to the effort of building that over a 2-hour video explaining the art tools and what he needs to look for and what he needs to do to get his assets in the StarCraft 2 at the proper settings. And I could tell just by skimming that release trailer that they didn't even do the animation correction correctly. And I know that it's something I mentioned in my video. And it's like, I will never, ever... This was already like my third fucking time having dealings with him, where he just demonstrated complete inability to understand basic communication whatsoever. The first 2 times he just basically disappeared off the face of the earth for years at a time. I don't know whatever compelled me to bother to going through the effort to begin with. But...
You made it 3, and then it was too much.
It demonstrates that, you know, he just didn't give a shit. He really just didn't give a shit.
Yeah.
And he didn't pursue quality. You know, he came to the person with the skills and the knowledge to do what he needed to do. I gave him the information that he needed to give to his artist, that he needed to enforce. He didn't put in the effort, so fuck him, right? Like fuck him. He could offer me the whole $90,000 to do one model, and I still wouldn't do it. Because for me, it's a matter of principle, right? Like, when I think about projects like this, I mean, I think even in your server at some point, some people was telling me I should do it for money or whatever, but I know it was something I had talked to, you know, people brought up in Mapster and people brought up in the Blender server that I'm in, is, you know, you should just do stuff for money and like, fuck no. I'm about character, I'm about quality. At the end of the day, the only thing that matters is about quality, and I could just as easily, you know... made account or whatever on something like Casting Call or whatever the hell it was called, you know, these voice acting websites, and I could have probably charged quite a lot of money, and I would have been building stuff for projects I don't give a shit about. And it wouldn't have been my best quality, because my best quality comes out when it's something I give a shit about, something that I build and that I'm really invested into. And at the end of the day, I mean, I guess I had money, but I still wouldn't feel accomplished. It's why I come out of StarCraft 2, despite being a part of all these large projects like StarCrafts and all this shit, and I don't feel accomplished just because it wasn't really my project. I was really helping them more like out of a pity thing. And, you know, in the case of StarCrafts, of course, I got really roped into it a lot more than I really wanted to be, but, you know, at the end of the day, it was still something I felt like, well, I do want to see you guys actually be able to finish this. And then they decided not to credit us at all. So I was, you know, that was a mistake. I should have really seen the writing on the wall with that one, with the way Carbot treated the project in general, where it was obvious that he had no idea how stuff works in terms of, like, you know, legal and, you know, really interacting with the development. And, again, it just brings me back to Vindicator, who is like the management of the mod aspect for that, and how he was telling me when he was desperately trying to get me and HKS on board to do the YouTube Red thing, we worry too much about quality and stuff like that, and that was just like, the Chinese fleet's coming for me and they're bearing less red than you are right now, and it was just like, you gotta bail now, do not ever get on board with something where somebody says quality doesn't matter, ever. Don't matter what they're paying you, it's not worth it, it's not worth your fucking dignity. And like that, like with the first impression, that's what I would hope that, you know, with a project that we come in with, is that maybe the project isn't something you really like agree with or whatever, but it's something that you can identify that there was effort placed into it, that there was a pursuit for quality, and that quality mattered. because that is not apparent in really any project that you really come across with commercial stuff these days. Is there is no pursuit for quality. It's not about quality. It's just about just quickly making a buck. You know, that's why we go into all the, like, the microtransactions, the ceremonies, the stimulation, you know, psychology and stuff like that. It's a long thing. You know, marketing, of course, is a tremendous subject all in its own respect. And it's just all about dishonesty. And the dishonesty aspect is this is not about making quality product. And I'm not about that. I'm about quality first. And like with D&D and stuff like that, when I think about quality, I think about less is more. I try not to... With the first impression, I like to try to set as we're heading for an immersive experience where I want things to be believable, which means that, you know, some characters really just are not that complicated, because many people are just really not that complicated. When it comes to me in real life, I'm not really a complicated person. I like to drink coffee, I like to sleep, and I'm very, very lethargic, and I hate working with stuff. And I get really stressed out when there's carpenter ants all over the goddamn place. So, you know, I'm just along for the ride trying to make things meet, and I don't really talk or really do that much. And it's like that's just me. It's not really that complicated. But then you go into, like, you sit down and for your day sitting in front of this glowing windows that is your computer monitors, and suddenly I've got 1,001 different projects going on. I'm doing these 3-hour-long casts on the internet, and, you know, I don't really get a benefit from this. It's just me sharing my knowledge and experience. And I go into D&D and I'm building that for other people, and now I've got this probably gonna be like 30 episode developer series for On a Win, that like 3 or 4 hours a piece. You know, that's gonna take me a long time to actually finish up. And we are trying to explain a lot of these abstract concepts and that. And of course, there's the Apex project. I actually want to make a roundup for this month, even though not that much has been done. I wanted to do a release a month. It's really just like, you know, that's just my thing, and that will probably not be the first impression you get. So, when it comes to, like, bonds and stuff, at the end of the day, when I think about a bond and why I would pursue for that in a game, and why I try to pursue for that, is because bonds endure. Which means, to me, a successful and a high quality project, it endures in the sense that those interactions survive the test of time, outlasting any individual experience. So you may spend however many hours trying to beat a map, but you can think back to it and remember it with some clarity, and the interactions with some clarity, and the identity with some clarity, that clarity it was carried with it, you know, in the future.
Right.
A successful and a high quality product is one that survives the test of time, in the sense that I look to stuff like Brood War and my 20 years of it. That is my target. That's my grounding. I want you to be able to look at something like Auto Wind when you're a player for it, of course, not an observer. I want you to be able to look at something like that and remember it in years to come. You know, I had Albion, the other short adventure we did before, Albion 1, 2, and 3. And I can still remember most of the things from those, in spite of all the stuff that's happened. And I think the players, to some extent, also remember that, probably some more than others, give or take. And to me, that's a quality experience. In that sense, it was never my intent to shit out like 2 dozen of these D&D campaigns, because, for one, there's a limit to my resources. But aside from that, it's because I can't conceivably create 2 dozen experiences of that kind of caliber. In the sense that when I look at Unreal and my Unreal project, I'm not thinking that this is the beginning of a dynasty of projects. I'm thinking I'm going to create the one project. Mm-hmm. I'm going to invest everything I've got into that one project. And if I manage to complete it, that's great. If I make another project, it will be something completely unlike that one. You know, it's like, when you think about Brood War, all these attempts to recapture Brood War are destined to fail. They're just destined to fail, because, for one, they're made by people who don't understand Brood War or why it was successful at all. You know, you got all these rosters of rejects coming out of Blizzard. They don't understand Brood War. They don't understand why Blizzard was successful. They don't understand the first thing about it.
Brood War is not even
That's
their
why they're
main
doing
thing that
what
they're
they're
looking to anyway, right? It's Warcraft 3 and StarCraft 2 and these games
Yeah.
that sold better or had microtransactions or whatever. Like that's where it becomes obvious that the auteurship, the idea that you're supposed to be this creative person passionately designing and developing content for people to enjoy and experiences for people to have, it just flies out the window when you see what their actual frames of reference are.
It's also really dishonest too, because they try to take these formulas that they don't understand, and then they try to either build off of them, or I guess in the case of Fraud Giant, they build off of Reddit instead. But like with Immortal or whatever, they try to take these existing formulas that they very clearly don't understand, and then they try to improve on them, and as opposed to trying to stake out and make their own independent thing. Now with an RTS, of course, an RTS is always going to have resource gathering and base building, and there's only so many ways you can take that and say mine is completely distinct. But when they advertise and present themselves and build themselves as coming out of something like StarCraft 2, they're already off on the wrong foot. Because regardless of the quality of StarCraft 2, you're trying to build something off of someone else's idea. And that's really not going to work. You want your project to be of a objectively high quality. The way that's going to start is by building your own bonds. And if your idea of a bond to the idea of making this game is because somebody else made a game, and you're going to make a game that's kind of like that game, and then you're going to change from that, you've already disjointed the emphasis of where that bond is going to be building from.
It's one of the things that really sticks out to me is the discussion of like, this is under the context of first impressions. And this is in the context of the idea that like, hopefully it's not just the first one. It's also the last one, or it's the lasting impression. Maybe it's that like, okay, when you come into it, you should be immediately struck by the idea that this is not just another cash grab or just another failed attempt at recapturing something from the past, or just something else that's derivative. It's something genuine. It's something high quality. You also want whatever that genuine and high quality experience turns out to be to stick with the player at the end of the day. Yeah. Something that, at the end of the day, there's a limited number of things. If you want to get epistemological, if you want to get perhaps even, midlife crisis-y, there's a certain number of things that you can do in your life with the time you have. So do things that are good, have experiences that are high quality, have stuff that sticks with you for a while. Not everything's going to. You can't have a life that's always at, racked to 10 out of 10. But if you
can have a life that's always -1 out of 10, like mine.
Yeah, well, maybe that even makes it more apparent when something genuine and high quality is, rolls across your table, so to speak, right? Maybe that's when it's even more noticeable. But regardless of where you feel like you're at on the scale, it's like, do things that are good and do things that enrich you. And the idea of, you brought up the TED Talk, you brought up the discussion of like people being overly stimulated and that being like the only way that they know the world they were raised up in. Maybe those people can't really discern between the stimulating experiences that are genuinely doing so honestly, doing so through high quality, and not doing so through loot boxes and ceremonies and these things that are more psychological and addictive, and more oriented towards stuff that's supposed to not really be part of games. If we're honest, like you're trying to, again, the idea that the conceit behind all these developers is always that they're supposed to be these creatives making art, but if they're really just factory workers stamping out things that are going to make some executive a lot of money, I don't think that's what most people would consider art. And unfortunately, that's what more and more games are turning into, right? So that's where I think, like, I just kind of, like, when you were explaining that, the idea of the first impression and the lasting impression, and you were talking about all that, I couldn't help but think that there's really not been many lasting impressions from games that have actually, that I could imagine were intentional. I think of Assassin's Creed franchise, and it's just a fucking ocean of bugs and everything being broken. It's
everything by Bethesda.
Yeah, you think of all that, and it's like, what is the experience? What was the enrichment? Was there enrichment? And often the answer feels no. So it kind of goes back to it. It's like, ideally, yes, your first impression can be good. good enough to match the quality of the rest of the game, which means, if the rest of the game is terrible, then hopefully the first impression clues you in early. And if the rest of the game is great, then hopefully the first impression also says as much and communicates as much. But it's obviously a tough thing. Just even the opening moments. This is why when you talked about thankless tasks in the last episode, it really it resonated with me, because even just to think about this and talk about it for 2-3 hours once every week or so is like, that's more effort than a lot of people would think goes into just quote unquote making a game. But it can be reduced down to such a granular level, at which point you really can sink your teeth into the finer points and figure out what makes it all tick and what could make it all work, what might be a better avenue to explore.
You went full fucking toaster on me there.
So I think we're back now after some technical difficulties. Do you remember what you were going to say as a result of all of my toastering? I was talking about being genuine and honest.
Yeah. Okay. What I was going to say is I was just going to interject briefly and say that the problem with first impressions is that a lot of these, especially modern most games, after basically because of game journalism, in as many air quotes as you can fit into the statement, became a thing. Pretty much all modern games and all pre-modern games, everything like PS2 and onwards, but even probably N64 and stuff like that's probably really in the West in particular, but it did become a worldwide issue, is you basically have what are like their trailer demo maps, their E3 maps. They try to pretty up as much as the first 5 minutes of the game, whatever is exposed to or instructed by the journalist, quote unquote, to play through for their previews or their reviews. That's pretty much where all of the budget for the product goes, and then all the rest of the product is just whatever shovelware they get slapped together or phone in at the last minute. And that's all for that first impression thing, because once they got your money, they're going to keep it. And that is it is fucking everywhere. And it's also really funny because when you know that, and then you walk into any given game, let's say, Skyrim, StarCraft 2, whatever, and the first couple minutes are as fucked up as they are, the rest of the product is going to be absolutely swell.
Yeah, because they're sending their best, and that in and of itself is the ultimate indictment. Their welcome wagon to you as the player is really what's supposed to hook you in and make you think that the rest of the game is not worth refunding on Steam. So if they can't even keep you for 2 hours, in some ways that Steam refund policy really does expose, obviously it creates a kind of perverse incentive where the designers of the game have to make a game that will hook players in and make them actually think that the game is good for at least 2 hours. At that point, I think you're probably more likely to get it's easier to just make a better game than to make the first 2 hours really good, but the rest of the game lazy. You know what I mean? I guess it still is easy to be lazier with the rest, but I feel like that 2 hour window probably might be a positive influence over the scene overall. I know there's a lot of people who say that they get they want to make an indie game that doesn't take 2 hours to beat, and then they get refund pranked or whatever, but maybe just don't release your game on Steam if that's the case. I don't know. But so the first impression thing is important to me to go a little bit more deeper on, because obviously, we were talking about earlier, one of the questions I had for you about bonds was, how do you do something in the sense of it being a fast forging bond? And, maybe you can do that without the same level of depth, but with a greater speed in a game than you can in an interactive digital game than a pen and paper tabletop type thing like D&D, where obviously the whole point is that people are here for the long haul. People are here to really experience something over many, many, hundreds of hours, if I had to guess. So when you're looking at a game instead, ideally there's engagement for hundreds of hours, but if you're just specifically trying to focus on a particular character, this is a puzzle that I'm currently, I wouldn't say stuck on. I'm working through, though. I'm trying to decide how to best present characters for the audience to very quickly identify with or find some form of connection to. And that's where the first impression thing is really important, because, I said this earlier, one of the campaign projects I'm working on involves changing perspectives a lot. And the characters that you're going to be with, okay, I'm expecting each mission to take about an hour. So in theory, you'll have a lot of time with them. But that hour is mostly gameplay. There's going to be dialogue. There's going to be these terse transmissions that are mostly about how, like the business at hand, the matter at hand, the content that you're, working through. And so in that case, it's battle information. And it's presented through a prism of, here's how this character relays battle information. And here's how this character responds to other characters relaying that. So you can get a little bit of characterization there, and I wouldn't want to undersell the importance of doing that well, but it's also a very limited toolkit. And it's something that you mentioned earlier, is that RTS as a medium is probably not super well cut out for forming bonds in the same way that you would do in a third-person game or a first-person game even. So do you have thoughts on how you might really strike first impressions and how you are planning to handle this, for example, in your own RTS work? And if you were to do it again, whether it's, StarCraft 2 or this like newfangled Brood War shit we're working on to try to improve the state of play there, the state of content design, how would you go about attempting to get people invested into a character? Do you think that my approach of having the changing perspectives makes it too difficult? Or what do you have to say about bonds at a fast pace where you can at least start the process of making that connection?
I think it would be difficult. I think that it could be done, but you would have to approach it in a really different way than I do. With an RTS in particular, with Apex, for example, I really wasn't shirking away from heavy dialogue cinematics, of course, between maps. So the way I viewed missions within the RTS and the way I wrote them out is between maps was fair games for long dialogue, long cinematics, or some other necessary non-gameplay element. But once you gave control to the player, you could never take it away until the mission was done. So that meant that there were... I would have to actually dig up the scripts to take a look, but there were certainly maps, particularly in mid and end, where there could be long strings of dialogue between two or more characters. Sometimes the internal dialogue, too, could also be long. And the other thing, of course, is that with the way I typically do the voicing and space stuff out is... I have a lot of dialogue. It can actually end up being quite a lot of real time that gets consumed by this stuff. And I know in general, a lot of the more modern crowd do not enjoy long cinematics or long dialogue like this. But at the same time, since I was targeting an extremely specific audience, which is something you generally are going to be doing depending no matter what you're doing, when you're trying to go into this kind of bond-driven content, let's call it, where we're trying to achieve certain interactions, you are always going to sync more with one group than the other because, again, bonds are quite subjective. But really, when I think about the RTSs in general and the way of doing this stuff through the long dialogue, is I knew that was going to be something that was probably going to be quite unpopular with a lot of people. But I also had kind of a goal with a lot of the writing. I don't know if that's the way I would write it out. I think today, if I was to write out something, that it would still be quite wordy at points. But I had it scale in a sense that I did not have too much of this dialogue in between missions for a fairly early chunk of the game, so that we can focus more or less on the character interactions in actual combat. So I think just about all of the Apex projects, regardless of which main character it was, you were brought into the first map with maybe 2-3 minutes of cinematic for the start of the game, period, and that was it. You were just thrust right into it. And there was maybe 1 or 2 of the non-RTS versions that had a longer portion to it. Like I had actually written out scripts for a audio play for Apex as an alternative concept, and that's where we entered a lot of longer, more, I don't like to say artsy, but really different than Retribution, for example. All of Retribution in that audio play is contained within, I think, close to 3 hours, which is actually quite a lot of content to go through, and a lot of the pacing in that, at the end of the day, returning to it some years later, I felt like the pacing is actually too fast in that. So, long, and personal presentation was a thing. Of course, like I said, first person. So, first person is how I did all the writing for this stuff. We didn't have the third person adjutant. We didn't have a narrator. We had a first person perspective. And that even includes the one where you're playing as characters that don't usually speak that much. And that would also be actually brought up in dialogue many times. And that interaction actually became a core thing within the later versions of Apex as I wrote around the interactions of this player character that doesn't actually speak, and that leads to some dialogue interactions as a result. For example, some of the enemies think that you are someone that you are not. You do not respond to them. They don't have any reason to think otherwise until actually the end of the mission you come out of what would be an impossible circumstance. And then they realize, something has changed. And then the dialogue reflects this. So, in such sense, and when I go... Okay, I thought someone was calling me, but I guess not. When I go into these first-person things, I look really heavily for not necessarily striking for emotions. When you end up with a lot with the first-person stuff and really character-oriented stuff in general, is people try to overemphasize emotions. And you can't do that. Emotions have to come naturally. So this is where the bond thing comes from. And one of the main reasons I go for that and through tribulations, kinship through tribulations, is to feel the intensity of a situation without being told that the situation is intense. So in other words, we would have something that gives a read of impact without forcibly shaking the screen and saying, oh no, it's dark and dramatic. So, of course, with like things like audio-visual storytelling and stuff like that, meaning for more subtle stuff. But also in the sense that if you feel the intensity and difficulty of a situation and it is portrayed correctly, there will never need to be a word uttered or an element introduced to tell you about the severity of any given thing that happens within the progression of the mission at large, be it an RTS or otherwise, or events that happen and related to the characters. There should be something the player should be able to pick up on their own just by extent of the context granted of everything up to that point. As a result of the extensions of their bonds with the things that are going on, they should feel something by association of things that are going on. Intense moments, situations, or dangerous moments or intense situations, or moments of elation and stuff like that should come naturally without having to change really much of anything that's going on at all, or especially without having to narrate it, either by words or through other more forcible means. Which is to say that when I went into these cinematics and stuff like that, they were done really to drive dialogue. Again, it was all dialogue driven. We really didn't have them to convey major events. Major events like major confrontations or surprise attacks or stuff like that, those all happened within the missions. So there was one map, for example, where you were attacked by a battle moon and you're not really well equipped to deal with this battle moon, and it kind of just comes out of nowhere. That's all done in mission. It's just something that happens towards the end of the map. Is one of those boss fights, battle moon shows up. And there's not really too much warning for it. So the first time it would definitely catch you off guard and you might have some problems. And then your second run you'd be more prepared for it. But, that's kind of like, you might just spring these things on people and they might be kind of coming out of left field in some cases. But that's also what's happening to the player characters too. So, in a sense, we show, don't tell. And this is just terminology that just rings true all throughout the entire process. The entire process is all very simple. And that's part of playing the character. Sometimes unexpected stuff happens. Sometimes dramatic stuff happens and there is no fanfare. Oftentimes there isn't. Then what you feel is the fanfare. So the process to build all this goes beyond just, however, the dialogue and the stuff like that. I have a way of handling music, and the audio in general and the visuals in general are very specific. I was in the process of constructing that in StarCraft 2. I had visuals and audio fairly heavily altered further, even just changing the way the Zerg looked, the specularity and stuff like that. But the Terrans, for example, particle effects, for like the Marine muzzle flashes and stuff like that, had all been redone. And all this was just building a palette to establish a much more fluid and believable world where all actions have weight and value to them, even down to the smallest units making attacks. The Marines muzzle flash in StarCraft 2 was just so limp-dicked and so lazy. I put a lot of time into that custom muzzle flash I made before the end of that project, and I was really happy with the end result. It wasn't perfect, but it was definitely a great starting point. And that's kind of what I really wanted, is that was my grounding point where everything had value. The smallest actions still had weight to them, just as I did in, say, Brood War, for example. And that meant that everything had grounding and consistency. Now, when we look at a character and we want to establish a bond with a character, and then we start talking about stuff like changing perspectives, that changes the mood. It's a very different mood than what I'm talking about. Something is I'm building over the course of 20, 30 missions to achieve what I'm wanting to achieve. I take a very long, slow, gradual, almost space opera approach to a lot of stuff. With something like what you're talking about, I think it most certainly can be done, but you're going to be building a different kind of experience altogether. When I think about an experience that might work like that, I might think about something that's not quite as serious. So with my projects, I tend to aim for a lot of psychological, like deeply rooted psychological manipulation, a lot of real slow, gradual honing, if you will, where I can have a lot of early established concepts within one or two maps, but I like to take my time and use the player experience and the player's tribulations as a way to help govern perspectives. And sometimes I will often opt for a longer as opposed to a shorter approach to accomplish something, because I feel like I can achieve more impact if there is more time for something to develop. And to the point that I would actually consider perspective changing at all in any context to be negative. But if I'm aiming for something where perspective changing is right off the bat, I think back again to the community projects where, there were more silly, lighthearted stuff. Changing perspective can be used as a storytelling mechanism altogether, more or less as a narrative mechanism, where instead of saying, meanwhile, this guy's doing this, we switch the perspective, and now this guy's doing this because you are this guy and you are doing this. So if one person is fighting in one edge of this battlefield doing whatever, someone else is having a struggle somewhere else, somewhat unrelated, but eventually these two meet up for whatever reason. Maybe they become opponents. We can use our narrative authority to switch the perspectives to tell both of their stories as they start independently and then eventually come across one another and build stakes for either side. But now we have the difficulty of creating a cognitive coherency where we can keep track of both of these two different stories going on at the same time, even though they're probably going to be unrelated, at least for a while, while also having the player be equally invested in both things going on at once, unless the objective is to never return to the originals at the same time. Then things become even more harder, because you will want to establish something that sticks with the player within a short amount of time, which means that you're basically going to have to drive for dramatic experiences and really distinct experiences between each mission. And then those experiences are what are going to become the defining aspects, especially when you are not really in a position where you can feed the player with a lot of exposition or dialogue or even really much distinction from the characters beyond the in-game interactions. So you have to make those in-game interactions stand out above and beyond what any spoken word can offer, that they can then withstand however long you're going to go without, or while needing to retain that context of that very first map. So we want your first tutorial map with Raynor jacking off some minerals to be present and retain memory retention all the way up until you're 30 missions in, getting banged by 50-footed Kerrigans, that experience is really going to have to stand out. So I would definitely say that's definitely a much taller task and one with much less room for failure.
Yeah, so let me shade in some more detail. Hopefully, the less ambiguous the picture becomes, the more pointed you'll be able to sort of poke holes in it. Because I've already considered a lot of things that maybe you'll see some obvious angle I haven't. First off, without revealing too many details on something that's still, I would prefer to keep close to the chest. The one of the interactions is that in a mission you play as a character who gets help from another character. So character B is the one arriving later, and they're obviously, they have some sort of relationship. You can tell that based on the dialogue. They have some sort of history together, but we don't worry about details too much. And the point is to keep the bond between those two characters ambiguous, so insofar as the player will wonder how serious it is, and then they'll be able to determine that based on what actions happen later in the story. But then we go into the perspective change after that mission that I'm referencing, is where character B, the one who arrives later, is actually a target of the perspective switch. So you were mentioning that, like, okay, maybe these two perspectives embody characters or present characters that will eventually become opponents. Well, that's precisely the point of this next section, is that this character that you're switching to is specifically hunting for character B. And so you already know that there's going to be, like, it's set up very obviously that there's a connection between these two, insofar as, like, if you want to use Chekhov's gun from the storytelling ideas, like, there's a gun on the wall, it has to go off by the third act if you see it in the first act or whatever. You can imagine something similar to this is happening, where it's like, if you're presented with the task of finding and bringing to justice this vagabond, then odds are you're going to go find that vagabond, and then depending on which character you're playing as in that perspective for that particular mission, you'll be one side or the other, or maybe you'll be both across multi like, if the battle takes long enough. So you can sort of see where I'm going with this, where, like, I precisely agree that you want these connections of the stories, you want whatever these characters are going through to connect together, and you probably want to do it in somewhat short order, unless you're willing to repeat, like, sort of retread and build them up independently, but still keep the vision of them colliding in sight, even if it's like a distant, like, I can sort of see it in the distance. It's kind of hazy, but it's clearly the destination we're going to. You could probably angle it that way if you wanted, but basically the idea is that you've got a character, he's the target of another character who you're perspective switching into, and then, in that particular sequence, he's not even there in the spot where you're initially gone to. So it's almost like the point is, we know where this target is because of our previous mission, and so it's sort of building onto it in that sense. One of the things you mentioned as well is the idea that characters, you almost have to, you're driving for drama or dramatic experiences so that these things can stand out. And I also have made this observation. It seems like the characters need to be iconic and distinct, because if you're going to take a slow burn approach, you at least have to give players enough to latch onto so that they are memorable. They might not bond with them, they might not identify with them, they might not think that much of them yet, but if you say the name, it should evoke a memory response, even if it's not an emotional or bond-based response, right? And so, like, you should at least be able to know who they are referencing, even if it's shrouded in mystery, even if it's somebody you don't have a lot of details on yet, just by the way that they talk, or the way that their dialogue is written, or the role that they played in the game where you were fighting alongside them and they did something very memorable or something to that effect. You could easily see how all of these elements could be leveraged for that experience. And so basically the method I've developed, or the model I've developed for this so far, is that you need these iconic characters that are memorable. And part of a way to make them memorable is obviously to do this bond thing we've been talking about this episode, but it's also to try and maximize distinct aspects of their personalities without it feeling like it's out of place for the project, which is also a tricky balance to solve. Another thing that you had mentioned is that some of your past work veered more towards, I mean, you said you didn't want to use the term artsy, but I feel like we have a consistent aspect there between us, where I very much enjoy leaning into what others might cynically describe as overly dramatic. I try to find ways to take these concepts, or even the verbiage of ideas and, the thoughts of the concepts that are extreme but memorable because of their extreme characteristics, and find a way to like square the circle where you're grounding them still and they don't feel out of place. They actually feel like a nice conclusion point or whatever. And it feels like natural that we got to this position that we're talking about it. And of course, a great counter example to that would be like, we start with Raynor in Wings of Liberty, and then we end with, Raynor killing Amon, helping to kill a dark god. Like, this is just so, like, if you wanted to build up to that, you had to take a different approach, right? And it's like, I don't want that exact experience, but I almost want to have something as crazy as literally killing a god, something as unimaginable in terms of scale, especially in the context of where you began. I almost want to be able to do something like that or analogous to that, but obviously I want it to be genuine and I want to build up to it. And that maybe that's a little bit outside of the context of the perspective switching and the idea of getting these fast bonds together, but it's also related in the sense of if your immersion has been fully maintained throughout the project, you've gotten from mission 1 to mission 30, as you were saying, then ideally at that point, like whatever the conclusion is, will be grounded and will be interpreted well, even if it is this like dramatic or artsy or like fantastical premise or some sort of event that maybe they wouldn't have fathomed, or they certainly wouldn't have expected based on the start. It even goes back to when you were talking about impressions of the races, where you were referencing the Anan or the Terrans or whatever, and it's like you're starting off with these more familiar things. It's a classic way to. It's even what I'm doing with my Zabalba universe, where you start off playing as the closest thing to Terrans that we have in some capacity, and that's the way that we approach like. We're kind of like sneaking in the absolute batshit crazy ideas, like we're letting you experience those later. And for now, we'll focus you on some more things. Although I do that for the tutorials basically, and then you play as like extra dimensional deities for the first campaign. So, but if you play the tutorials, then you get an introduction to the world. It's not just a tutorial in terms of gameplay, right? It's also almost like priming you for how to interpret the setting. And how to sort of like map your experiences from other worlds and other media onto it. So there's a lot that goes in there and a lot I threw at you. But do you have any thoughts based on how I've shaded in more details about the perspective switching and the character design, if you will, being really priming for memory, and the more dramatic prose perhaps taking some time to flower it in there? Any thoughts there on how that colors your understanding? Do you see an obvious angle I've missed with the characterization, or do you just sort of reaffirm that it's probably just going to be really hard?
Well, I think it like when my first impression was that the jumps would be maybe loosely connected. I don't think you're going to connect them like objective wise. So I think that will definitely help a lot.
Yeah, it's basically right back to back insofar as like when you establish a character, then your next one is related to that. Or, I mean, maybe it's not always this case, but the idea is that we at least do that enough times that even if there isn't a point where we immediately connect two perspectives,
you will come to expect it.
The expectation of the player is that, oh, this is connected in some way and I just don't see it yet,
Yeah. So that will definitely help. I mean, it'll still be difficult, but I think it's much more manageable in that context, because having a good, strong example of where you're going to end up in each point means that, if that connection is not very obvious or you're finding the jump too dubious, then you usually have a few knobs you can tweak to make that cleaner. And, in regards to like the high drama stuff, my projects are definitely all insane. I mean, in Autumn Winds, you start this, I mean, they're high level players, so they kind of sort of already expect from the context of my other projects that insanity is on the horizon. It's just a matter of when it's going to show up. And then the game starts where they come to the countryside because the king calls them to search for the prince who got abducted by bandits. And at the end of the campaign, they're fighting a kitsune that's basically the embodiment of this dark moon that encompasses infinite space, but it's small enough to fit in your hand, of the source of all knowledge, and it's shedding like stars, and they're trying to call in help from these other dark stars and these gods, and there's such thing as trying to stop it from shedding. to try to disrupt it so it can be imprisoned by another goddess. And, half this stuff doesn't even make sense to them. They're jumping between these mental realms called suspended motion, where they're being attacked in a manner that it basically creates damage that doesn't exist until it's brought into reality. And you got all this crazy shit and stuff that's never been done in D&D 5th edition before, as far as I know. And the RTS stuff was like that too. It was with Apex, it has, well, I mean, you can think of like Armageddon Onslaught. Armageddon Onslaught's kind of like you threw in something into StarCraft that can take on 7 Protoss and Terran, and I kind of just worked up from that, where we, in Apex, I think in one of the concepts as early as Mission 5 or Mission 6, we ran into the Necropolis, which I know there's a few people that watch these discussions now that are familiar with Apex. The Necropolis are very similar to what they are in the D&E, just much, much larger scale. In the RTS version, you can almost think of them kind of like the Necrons in Warhammer, just a lot worse. And you were fighting that this onset of this thing that was just pretty much impossible to really control, and really required like massive map control, and you're constantly juggling, your locations and barely trying to survive, and things just continue to get out of control from that point. So with building bonds and stuff like that, in the believability sense, all this groundwork, what it really amounts to is, once you've got this established, then you put the players and the player characters through extreme situations. And this is the next part of the idea, is that once you have this grounding and once you're confident in it, then you can take off the training wheels and you can say insane shit's going to happen. And the player and the player character are going to experience it as one. And that's where the whole believability thing and stuff comes in mind, because when you start throwing in a lot of this stuff that's insane, the player character should respond to it in a believable way, and in a way that makes sense to the player. It may not be the way that the player responds to it, but it has to be something that makes sense to them.
Yes, yeah.
And, that means it just taps all the other switches we talked about previously, which is, the player characters are something you can confide in to react and behave in a way that is believable, acceptable, and responsive, in a way that, even if it's dialogue, it's something that you can believe to be a gut reflex to the way something is happening, right? So
yeah, I mean, so this is another thing that I try to leverage incredibly early on, like from the first moment that you're being engaged with the project that I'm working on. There's an establishment of a specific character, and I'm deliberately using a sort of hysterical foil of somebody who's just in like total panic based on the context of what's happened, or what's about to happen more accurately. And the response from the character, we're really focused on establishing the character you're really playing as in this particular mission, is to just sort of calmly de-escalate the interpersonal situation, and then just give terse orders to an expectant military. And the idea is that this guy's obviously going to be in charge, but we still have an establishment that this is not a normal situation, that for perhaps normal people who are not as steeled as a veteran of this particular character's stature, this is something to be worried about. This isn't something he's naive about, right? Our protagonist in this particular mission is not an idiot. It's not a fool. He's very clearly aware of the situation, and also very clearly confident in at least having a game plan, or at the very least, he's showing off a facade of confidence that maybe is actually fallacious, and maybe he is actually terrified, but he knows enough to, he knows better than to sort of show that side to his subordinates in that respect, right? He's instilling this confidence, and hopefully not just in the military that he's leading in universe, but also the player, that there is a plan, because that goes into the whole idea of like, what are your initial expectations? If you've never played a project that's like this, and well, let's face it, if that would apply to anything that you and I would make, because what we would make has not been done before by definition, right? So you've never played anything like this. You've never experienced an RTS campaign that's like this. And so when things happen that you wouldn't expect, when state changes occur, or when, other players arrive partway through the production in the middle of a mission, which is something that most people wouldn't even fathom, then as a result of that, right, we're sort of like, no matter what happens, this protagonist for the opening map knows what's going to happen, knows that it has happened, has a plan or seems to have a plan for what it is. Don't panic, even to the player, right? It's almost like stick along, and hopefully just the fact that he's reacting this way in universe, where he does seem to be pretty knowledgeable, he does seem to be pretty confident, and he does seem to have a plan, right? We have somebody arriving in the middle to help him, perhaps, or some reinforcements are on the way, or there's some ace in the hole. He's done this before. He's been in situations like this before somehow. That sort of thing is supposed to be obvious without us expositing as much, right? We just have him react, and we have the player pick up on that as they whether they're like really deliberately trying to or not. And I do think that's one example of how you would probably, you'd have to go into some sort of movie or book or something in order to find a proper example of it off the top of my head, because most games they don't really know what is going on about show over tell. And that's not to say that movie scenes in games would be an improvement necessarily either, because they'd still be written and directed often by game developers. So it still wouldn't even really be good as a game, as a movie scene, but it's also just not the way that you ought to do it for an interactive media, which, like you said, ticks all the boxes we've always talked about. So, but yeah, I mean, it's when you have that impression of a character and they help color in and shade in details of the world as well, where something absolutely absurd happens, how does the character react? That makes it even more powerful if something does happen that they could never predict. If something does happen that is even mind-bending to them and takes them a second to adapt to, and then oh, well, this person reacted with utter grace and confidence up until this point. They seem to have a plan the whole way through, even if things didn't go exactly to plan, and even if they showed a bit of frustration now and then, because obviously they're a character and not a robot. They would have, okay, well, they seemed like they recovered very quickly. But this actually fucked them up. This must be some really insane stuff,
Yes, that's, when you're like with an RTS, one of the biggest issues with RTSs and their writing is they might start on the large scale, the macro scale, and then they introduce their characters, and then they completely lose sight of that large scale. And then the player loses sight of the large scale too, because the game no longer really shows it off that much. Like, say, with Warcraft 3, for example, that first you have, Arthas and the undead and the calling, and Arthas did nothing wrong, and, I'm sorry, designer Dave, but the plague is not COVID. And, we lose sight of that very fast, though. We lose sight of that very fast. And then no longer do we have any grasp on the actual scale of the effects of the undead in anywhere of the game. We show like some ruins, villages here and there, but all of our stuff is just then becomes this inter-character drama that we don't really give a shit about, particularly in Frothing Throne, where a lot of the scale just completely is lost. And it's not just lost in the player in a sense, because the game is very small scale and we're always doing gimmick maps. It's also like the player characters never really reference too much of anything that's really going on at all. And they always allow the dumbest of shit to constantly be clouding their judgment, and they're always focused on the smallest scale stuff all the time. And for one, it's not believable for characters of their age and their stature and stuff like that to behave as they do. And, for two, it makes the game world very hard to read in terms of like what is actually happening. What is my actions as a player actually contributing to the progression of the game world and the writing as a whole. Nothing really has any impact anymore, and it just becomes a slog of just memes. That's pretty much what all of Warcraft 3 is, just memes. And StarCraft 2 falls into precisely the same thing too, especially when, as aforementioned, the disconnect between the established writing and stuff that's actually happening in the game. And then we throw in all this shit, like we just show up at IR randomly XD and conveniently pull out all these ancient weapons XD, but we never really retake ire at that point, despite having all this stuff apparently here still for some. Oh, and then there's Tacit Dumb and prophecies, and none of this shit really seems to influence the actual game world in a tangible manner that the player can even see, much less interact with, and it just all feels so nebulous. Like there isn't really a living, breathing world going on, and the characters never really interact with a living, breathing world, or really even give off that semblance, which means that a lot of the reactions that come out, it's only because of the character stuff, and as a result, that serves to chew down the weight of actual events in the game, like, you know, liberating major planets or attacking major planets or stuff like that, or destroying fleets or something like that. This stuff just really, like in Brood War, we had the UED fleet and all this stuff like this, where they took the Dominion shipyards. For some reason, this hyper advanced force from Earth that had their own fleet had to take over other people's shipyards and use their what would be considered very inferior technology to service their ships, instead of having some kind of contingency plan for long distance travel and servicing in general. You know, there's a whole bunch of like real stretching of the goat hole with that alone. But then, you know, when all this stuff apparently gets done, we never really see anything about ships at all again. And the way that the Space Forces in general are handled in that game is just very much like Blizzard didn't even really want to try to think about how space combat or travel or anything is handled in this. Then we have like stuff like the Protoss, for example. Their psionic communication, how all the Protoss are linked to the Kala. Well, they only hear about certain things once they reach certain places, and it just makes no fucking sense at all. So absolutely, like when you're talking about these characters and their reactions with stuff, one way that you make these things, of course, with consistency, but is to establish once you've established how the world works in some shape or fashion, everything that goes after that point has to work within those rules. And you can't, like, again, major issue with all commercial products is you can't make special excuses on how something works just to try to force a certain experience on a player character because it's more dramatic and epic that way. When people smell bullshit from a mile away when it comes to stuff like this, which means that some things can resolve in non-dramatic ways. You know, maybe it's not amazing, great American writing, but not all stories end with really convenient plot devices and circumstances just because you want them to.
Well, if you have something like that, then it definitely needs to build up to it. And then even once you get to the build-up, right, if we're going to still use that Amon example I brought up where somehow Jim Raynor is helping kill a fucking dark god, it's like, okay, well, okay, this is a crazy premise. Maybe this premise could work if you actually built up to it, like maybe that doesn't have to be said in an eye-rolly I think Dark God is eye-rolly no matter what, but maybe, if it's some sort of god of malevolence or some sort of deity that has their own agenda and, maybe they're an interesting character and maybe they're being engaged with by interesting characters who are admittedly way out of their depth, sort of like what you were talking about with your D&D players, not really even fully comprehending the mechanics of what was happening, more so just along for the ride, but certainly with a goal in mind. Maybe that's how you present these more worldly characters. Maybe that's how you present these characters that are meant to be closer to humans than not. And yet instead they just the fucking deadpan dialogue in that last mission where Raynor's like, I'm taking a base in front of Amon, like in the void in front of Amon's, like, dude, you can't even say that. Like, how do you have a straight face with this? If your voice acting and your script writing is basically identical to, when you're responding to Mensk sending 2 fire bats at you or something, you know what I mean? Like you're in the fucking void in the domain of a deity that has tried to break a cycle that has apparently been happening for millennia, and you're just going to have dialogue that's no different than when you're fighting a couple of rabble rousers or whatever on a backwater shithole planet. Like, it's just totally discordant with everything else. Like, that's one of the many problems, obviously, but if they had at least tried to present these characters in a way that made sense and would have helped actually make that area memorable besides all the memes, like genuinely and intentionally memorable, then at the very least they could have made things that really the player couldn't imagine and also the characters that are experiencing it couldn't really fully fathom. But instead, it's just like, oh, well, here's this like AIDS that damages you if you step in it, and then your reward for killing it is Tassadar as Zelnaga.
Also, 40 experience points for your account. Go get him, Reddit. Achievement Hunters Unite.
I honestly did like keeping that on just to remind myself that what I was playing was a total disaster, but...
Yeah, I guess it's a way of keeping your brain in the gutter so you don't actually have to wake up and realize, oh my god, I'm actually doing this.
Yeah, it's like, oh, at least I got experience points. So
when I first saw that, it destroyed me in the nether realm. Like, it just transcended time and space. Pain was felt across all my existence. I just couldn't believe I thought I was being memed on.
As if 1,000 Mesks cried out at once and were suddenly silenced.
Yeah.
You know, speaking of Star Wars, they have a pretty, like, the original Star Wars film has a pretty obvious example of what we're sort of talking about, where we have these, like, more learned, you know, I guess, like, the Jedi characters or whatever. They kind of, like, they have this idea that they are a veteran. They just don't react to stuff that would blow other people's minds. But you have this easy character of Luke, where he's the protagonist and he's the guy who's never seen any of this stuff before, but he's heard the tales and he's like really interested and he has some like childish line essentially where he's like, I want to learn the ways of the Force and become a Jedi like my father. And it's like, okay, well, maybe like there's a line there, and it's basically him saying that he's wrapped up in the mythology of it, but he still feels the call to the adventure or whatever. And he's totally ignorant of what all that means. And he has no idea what any of that really means. And then he finds out over the course of these films. And it's not the greatest storytelling. It's not even the most like unique or whatever. It's just a very obvious quintessential example of not only the hero's journey, which has been done to death a million times, but also the idea of like, here's a character who doesn't know the universe, and it's perfect as it's certainly very easy and very convenient as a way for establishing that universe and communicating that universe, because they're learning alongside the player, just like you were talking about, you know, the characters struggling alongside the player. So and there's a lot of parallels there.
Yeah. Did you have anything else you wanted to add to this?
I think right now we're definitely at a stopping point. I, of course, was going to broach the topic of plots and stuff, but obviously we've already covered most. We're going on the
we
third
ended up
hour
going
here,
quite into that, I think. At least a little bit, anyway.
Yeah. So there's going to be plenty of time to do more, so we can save that and maybe anything else that comes up. I don't know if you had any real final summation of the Bond talk or of anything else that came up, but I think we broached these topics, and sometimes they can, as we all know, they can divulge or sort of you peel away a simple seeming exterior and you reveal all the shit underneath. Takes much more time to digest. So
I think I had like 4 or 5 hours of conversation recorded for that original discussion about bonds. And I went through most of it, and I was like, this doesn't make a damn lick of sense. Because it is definitely one of the things that I was still trying to figure out how to word. So I'm not really like too happy with where I leave it off with that, because it's like, I feel like there's probably better ways to concisely explain what it is I'm trying to get in with this. But again, words are not really my thing. So it's kind of really a hard thing to get into. But you could think of it as kind of like the meat of what I aim for across all the things I've tried to make in a long time. Where, well, I started building RTSs and there was some characters in them, but my stuff was all total conversions and not campaigns. So there really wasn't like much grounds to even pursue storytelling in these projects. There was a couple attempts at campaigns or cinematic projects or whatever, mostly with Warcraft 3, a couple in StarCraft, but nothing really major, a couple in Age of Empires, but they were more like excuses to create the melee experience in the campaign, and I never really viewed them quite as much as building the stories. The stories were just like an excuse. Of course, by the time I had gotten into StarCraft in 1998, I had already been writing novels for quite some years. I had been building stuff in the tape deck for a long time, and that was kind of all with character-centric stuff. And I think I just felt for a long time that video games really were not the most amazing way to do this kind of stuff. I mean, I played so many different genres like shooters and stuff like that, but I never really had felt the draw to player characters in games. Of course, you can always make the argument that a lot of early games are really light on storytelling in general, anyways. But it sort of felt that was really the point. That most games just really didn't need to have that much storytelling. They really didn't need to have that much character. You know, think about like R-Type 3. It doesn't really need a lot of this stuff. It does what it does and does it very well. It doesn't overstay its welcome in that sense. Especially a lot of arcade stuff is going to be super light on that. And sometimes when you come across a lot of these older stuff, whenever they do bring up the storytelling things, it tends to be really jarring and disruptive. So, when I think of like what would be a defining moment for that, it was probably when I started writing scripts for the Unreal projects. Of course, Retribution and stuff like that pushed a lot into that, and the audio, digitalizing the audio, radio plays and stuff, and eventually like Retribution and sort of, I guess, spreading my wings and writing out actual major dialogue, and then putting that alongside actual mission concepts, along with the actual tests that I did within StarCraft 2. Never really quite reached a point where I could confidently say whether the approach held lasting merits. Wouldn't be really put to the test until D&D. And the feedback I got for that in D&D was generally really good. So I felt like that it was definitely something that withstood the test of time, that went through a lot of million iterations. You know, all the way from the writings of what eventually led to Throne of Armageddon, to the mods and their campaigns, to then Retribution, to then a Retribution audiobook, and then finally ending up in D&D. It all just got refined and distilled and chiseled down, and the cruft got slowly broken away, and we ended up with a concept that now, if I have to dial back and try to lay it on a paper and explain to another person that says, this is how this process works, this is why I do what I do, it has become suddenly so much harder to do that, because now it's just something that's ingrained into reflex. Like right now I'm pretty tired, but you know, people lined up to me and said, we're ready to play D&D. I didn't go down there and sit down for 5-6 hours. I can play that with confidence because I just kind of like enter a zone. And when you enter that zone, you're no longer really thinking about stuff like, you know, I got to role play this way, I got to write out stuff this way. It just comes as second nature. For me, it's second nature. I don't even think about it. You know, I mentioned before, for me, a world doesn't exist, you know, in normal circumstances, where I can't just like snap my fingers and suddenly I have what I want in terms of what I want something to feel like, to look like, to sound like. The only problem is abstracting that. With limited vocabulary and no real artistic skills to speak of, it's more difficult than not. But I'm hoping, things are obviously a damn mess, and they're always a damn mess. But I would like to have a playable demo to you for the Unreal project at some points. And it's going to be very bare bones at the minimum. But I'm actually hoping that that can be used as a initial presentation for the audio-visual storytelling arm of these kinds of discussions, because it will be the first time I ever build something that is actually like a demo of this, in the sense that another person can play it, versus technical concepts. So it's going to be very different than anything else I have ever shown. And that is something I kind of actually look forward to seeing and building. I've sort of started the building blocks of that, but it'll be a while before I reach a point where I can do that. And I think that might be I'm hoping it can be a time where I can really put a lot of this stuff to proof, to show, but as definitely that's sort of outstretching the scope of what this demo is going to be like. I'm not sure if other people are even going to be able to run this very well, because I don't know how well their hardware is, how good their hardware is compared to mine, and I already kind of struggle with this the way it's set up right now. So, while evidently not a short-term objective, it is something I'm hoping that one day I can demonstrate and talk about.
Well, you know, that's something I've always thought about, or thinking more about these days anyway, is the idea that we have all these ideas and we try to communicate them without a counterexample, without something that you can just point to and say, here's something where it's actually being explored. Here's something where it's actually happening. Like that's when you really get somewhere, and that's where I think it's easy. It's the same thing as technical demonstrations. It's demonstrations of something that you've tried to work on, or some idea that you've tried to communicate before. If people can just sit down and play it, they're going to have a much easier time interfacing with the idea and coming to their own conclusions, as opposed to trying to decipher whatever you're able to communicate via words or text or anything like that. So I'm looking forward to it, and obviously assuming it was at that stage and you had sent me it, and assuming that you were permitting public videos of it, it would be quite an interesting sort of experiment at that point to see.
Well, this is something I will release privately, but I will allow recordings.
Okay, cool. A fitting note to end on, actually. So I suppose this is it for this episode of the Big Boys Table, but we'll be back at some point, hopefully with less carpenter ants.
Hopefully.
And yeah, that's it. Smoke weed, don't die.
Smoke weed.